Good morning. Welcome to the 2020 Arizona Tax Research Association Outlook Conference. For those of you that are new to an ATRA event, I'm Kevin McCarthy. I'm the president of the Arizona Tax Research Association, and I'm grateful for all of you joining us today for our first ever virtual Outlook Conference. If you'd have told me back in March that we were going to be doing our annual conference through this means, I would have been more than a little nervous about that. But I certainly wouldn't have predicted that we would have our largest turnout for the Outlook Conference ever. So we're grateful for all of you to be here today participating in the conference. Before we get started and kick off the program, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, we want to have as much involvement from you as possible. So there's in your screen, there is an opportunity to ask questions. At the bottom, there's a button, a Q&A button, that allows you to submit questions. We'll be tabulating those questions as the presentations proceed, and to the extent we have time available, we'll ask those questions of the various presenters. The second issue is when the presenters load slides, you will see a reduced screen of that presenter. We want you to know that you have control over that screen. You can move it and drag that screen. So if the screen is covering a slide that you desperately want to see, know that you can grab that screen and adjust it. You can also increase the size of the screen if you want to see a larger version of that of the speaker in that process. So without further ado, we're going to kick this off, and I'd like to introduce, to kick off the conference, the Director of Governmental Affairs for Freeport-McMoRan, Richard Bark. Richard is the chairman of the Arizona Tax Research Association, and he will do the early introductions. Richard.
Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate you all joining us today for what we believe to be an excellent program. I know I enjoy the ATRA conference every year. It's the official kickoff for the beginning of, I was prepared for the legislative session. For many years, the Outlook Conference has proved to be an excellent opportunity for taxpayers, government relations, and elected officials to get together to discuss important public finance issues, and that'll be true this year too. Now, while the pandemic prevents us from getting together, we're excited about today's great program. Now, before we start, and I promise this won't be too long, I wanted to recognize our sponsors today for the generous support of the webinar. And we truly mean that. Our copper sponsors are the University of Phoenix, Arizona Public Service, Salt River Project, and Freeport-McMoRan. Our silver sponsors are Tucson Electric Power, Cox Communications, and Lumen, which is formerly CenturyLink. Our bronze sponsors are Fenimore Law Firm, Intel, Lewis Roca, Rothgerber, and Christie, and the Arizona Cattlemen's Association. And our premium sponsors are BS Strategies, AZ, Arizona Policy Connect, Kavanaugh Law Firm, Southwest Gas, and Veritas. Now that we have those formalities out, we thank everybody for sponsoring the conference this year. To get started, we're starting with the outlook on the budget and the update on the state fiscal outlook. And who else could we have but Richard Stabnick? He's a favorite of the ATRA conference. There you are, Richard. Now, I'm a great believer that the more famous you are, the less introduction you need. And I don't know who more that could apply to than Richard. He's been the director of the Arizona Joint Legislative Budget Committee since 1997, and I'm not sure how long before that you were with JLBC, but I've known you ever since I've been around the legislature. He deals with the budget in good and bad times, and delivers the news straight and is a trusted source of information. Richard, we thank you for being here today by video link, and turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. Richard and I go way back when he was on legislative staff, and while we have, I've been around so long that I was here when those trees were still standing, which were jacaranda trees, and Polly Rosenbaum used to say every spring when they started to bloom, it was time to end session. So I also want to thank Kevin, Jennifer, and Sean for inviting me to speak today. It's always a great pleasure to speak at the ATRA conference, and as well to congratulate you all on your 80th meeting. That's a great accomplishment. And so what I'm going to try to do today is give you an update on the budget process. Jeff needs to sort of, okay, we got the right slide there. Want to give you an update on the budget process and what it might look like in the session coming up. So I think, let me start with some key points. And one of those is, since the pandemic began, in general, revenue collections have just been much higher than we've anticipated. The lows weren't as low as we thought they would be in the spring, and now revenues are growing more quickly than we anticipated that they would. So in that regard, that's one general theme, in the sense that revenues have been higher than we've anticipated. What I'm going to be talking about today is primarily the numbers that we released last month at October Finance Advisory Committee, but I want to go and get into those a little deeper and give you some sense of what may lay ahead. So at October FAC, we projected that the ending balance for the current year that we're in right now, that ends in June, would be $411 million. And then for fiscal 22, which begins next July, it would be about $93 million. Now, we already know, based on sort of continuing surprising revenue trends, that those numbers are probably too low. And they will grow by the time we release a new forecast in January. But the other thing to keep in mind is that beyond sort of just the underlying economy, the course of COVID and the federal policy responses could also have a significant impact with regard to our revenue forecast and our overall budget situation moving forward. So let me talk about some caveats with regard to the overall budget. And that is that I think these October estimates are predicated on there being no long-term spike in COVID and no wide-scale business shutdowns. If either of those circumstances were to occur, then I think we would have to rethink the forecast in some ways. We've received, and I'll talk about this more, we've received a lot of money from the federal government that has helped prop up the economy. And that stimulus package is beginning to be depleted. And so that is a downward risk for the Arizona economy, but an upward possibility is a new federal aid package. And we'll talk more about that throughout the course of the presentation. But let me just give you one example of where federal aid can really have a very significant impact on the Arizona budget. And this provision doesn't get as much attention as some of the other stuff in the CARES Act, but there is a provision that allows us a greater match rate, allows every state a greater match rate for Medicaid. So the feds are paying more and the states are paying less. And if that were to remain in place for all of fiscal 22, which is not embedded in our numbers at this point, that would generate additional savings to the state, all else being equal, of over $500 million. So it's an example of how the federal government continues to respond to the pandemic will have a significant impact on our budget moving forward. I think this slide is probably maybe the single most instructive slide that I have in this entire package. And what it shows is Arizona personal income since the beginning of 2019, calendar year 2019, and it shows what personal income growth is. And essentially it was between 4 or 5%, something like that, before you got to the pandemic. And then what happened? Then you'll see in the dark blue bar that personal income actually grew by 11%. We just didn't envision that. And that's largely due to federal pandemic aid. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. And you see that point because in comparison, if you strip out what are called transfer payments, which are all federal payments of any sort to individuals in Arizona, we were actually down by about 1%. That's the light blue bar on the right-hand side. And again, if you had told us in April that we would only lose one, apart from federal aid, we would only lose personal income to the extent of 1%, we just would have thought that was way too low, or way too high, excuse me. And so I think what this demonstrates is, one, federal government aid helped the state out tremendously, and two, the underlying economy was performing so well that even when you exclude the federal aid, we didn't drop that much in terms of our personal income. But I would like to talk a little bit more about where all that federal aid came from. And so Arizonans directly received about $32 billion in federal aid. Now, another $6 billion went to state and local governments, and I'll talk about that toward the end of the slideshow in terms of a major piece of that. But let's just focus for the moment on where all this additional $32 billion came from. You'll see in this chart, we've outlined four major sources. One is the Paycheck Protection Program and sort of related federal aid, related business aid, and that generated for the state about $13 billion. Again, just to put that into context, our general fund budget is $12 billion. So that really was a significant amount of assistance to Arizonans, some of which backfilled some of their losses and some of which is probably net gain to their bottom line. Unemployment insurance, there's about $10 billion spent on unemployment insurance. Those stimulus checks, the $1,200 and the $2,400, that generated about $6 billion for Arizonans. And hospitals and healthcare providers generated about $2 billion. So again, that gives you a sense of the Arizona economy has been able to do better than we thought it would because of this huge infusion of federal aid directly to Arizonans. And you can tell some of that in the next slide, because it's going to show you how we're doing year to date in terms of our revenue growth. Now we're up by 20%. Now that number is misleading because, as you're all aware, we deferred the filing of income taxes from April of 20 into July of 20, or what effectively is fiscal 21. So that number is disproportionately high, and you can tell that by individual income as a revenue category growing by 31%. If you strip out the impact of the deferral, the real growth rate is something closer to 6% so far year to date. But nonetheless, growing much greater than we would have thought just about 8 months ago. Want to note that the other category, and I'll talk about this more in detail here shortly, and that is sales tax is up by 12%. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But even though we just forecasted a month ago, we're already exceeding that rate by about $100 million just with our October collections, and you can see that sales tax leads the way in terms of what is giving us gains above that October forecast. So let me then talk a little bit about our state revenue forecast. And again, if you've been through this process at all before, you know how we at the JLBC put together our revenue forecast. It's called a 4-sector forecast. It involves 2 econometric models at the University of Arizona. It involves forecast of revenues from the Finance Advisory Committee, which is a group of 11 leading economists from across the state. And then the 4th component is the JLBC staff. So we take those 4 sectors, average them, and that's what generates our revenue forecast that we make 3 times a year. And what you'll see from this chart is that in 21, in October, the forecasted growth rate was 7.8%, and 22 was only 1.6%. And again, the reason why 22 looks so low is because 21 has 2 filing periods in it, 2 income tax filing periods. And in 22, hopefully we get back to just 1 filing period. So that's one explanation of why that 22 number looks so low. But then if you attempt to strip the deferral out, and so you get a better sense of what things look like without that, that shows that the October number actually projected to decline in 21 of 1.7% and then would grow by 6% in 22. That 21 number is clearly too low and is one of the reasons I began this presentation by saying that I think by the time we get to January, we'll be reforecasting our revenues upward to a more realistic number for this year. And then in the long run, you see that the revenue growth is forecasted about 4 to 5%, which again are, when we ask our panelists, what do you think our long-term growth rate is? It does tend to end up being in the 4 to 5% vicinity. Now I want to talk a little bit about sales tax, because I had mentioned before that they were up by about 12% through the first 4 months of the year. And I think we're clearly experiencing right now a sales tax bubble. And so the question is going to be, how long is that going to continue? You can see some of the trends, and what we've tried to do here in the chart is show you what happened in the fourth quarter of 20 or in the spring, and what happened in the first quarter. And I think it's instructive in several ways. First, in terms of retail sales, even though we're in the middle of the worst of the pandemic last spring, retail sales still grew by 5%. And now they're growing by, in retail, just the retail component of sales, overall TPT is growing about 19%. Contracting hasn't skipped a beat since the beginning of the pandemic. You'll see that growth rate, 18–19%. So our construction industry has done well over the course of the last 6 months. What has not done well, and this is no surprise, no news to anybody, but what I like about viewing restaurant and lodging through the prism of TPT or sales tax is those are real collections. When you get jobs numbers, those are survey numbers. Those can have some challenges at times, but these are sort of the bottom line receipts in both the restaurant and bars and lodging. And you'll see that restaurant and bars really took a hit in the spring with a decline of 32%. It's better, but it's still hard times in the restaurant industry. Lodging, even worse. They were down by about 67% in terms of receipts in the spring. That has improved somewhat, but it's still down 34%. Let me talk a little bit more about why we think Jeff, if you go back, please. Why we think that the retail is so high. One is because we're all out there buying durable goods. If you look at the US data, durable goods spending right now is up about 15% compared to the prior year. And that's been true for like 2 or 3 months now. So we're out there buying, but at the same time, we are also not consuming as much in terms of services. And if you look at the US number in terms, overall US number in terms of service spending, it's down 5% compared to a year ago. So that benefits, assuming that that is somewhat comparable to Arizona, that benefits the state in terms of its revenue collections because we tax durable goods and we don't really tax services. So that is going to end up generating additional revenue beyond what we had anticipated. Just to give you a couple of Arizona specific numbers, our retail sales in the first quarter were up for autos by about 12%, building materials within retail up by about 23%. So I think that's, again, both indicators of the strong activity that's going on in both durable goods as well as within sort of the contracting industry in general. And then finally, as you all know, we started to tax internet sales last October. So we're about completing that full cycle. That clearly has helped these numbers. And so we'll see what impact that is now that we've got a full year under our belt. But again, I think that's a component of explaining the growth in sales taxes that we've seen over the course of especially over the course of the last 4 or 5 months. Now I want to shift to the other sort of best real-time indicator of Arizona revenues, and that's withholding. But first, to understand withholding and why the results there are surprising, let's look at our job numbers. What this shows you is Arizona employment compared to the same month in the prior year. I find this chart interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that our drop during the spring was almost as deep as the Great Recession, but at the same time, it shot right back up. So it was, obviously nowhere near the depth in terms of a somewhat longer term perspective than the Great Recession was. But I think the other interesting point relative to this slide is despite the fact that jobs are still down by 3%, withholding is actually in positive territory. And I think what that indicates is that the job losses, as we've just talked about, have probably occurred in lower paid industries such as lodging and restaurant and bars. And the rest of the employment sectors have remained relatively healthy. So again, I don't think we would have forecasted that back in March and April when the pandemic first hit, but it clearly has helped us in terms of our overall revenue collections that withholding continues to be positive. Now I want to turn to spending. And again, if you're familiar with sort of the JLBC process and the JLBC baseline, you're aware of this, but let me just sort of, if you're not, what JLBC does every year is it goes in and it forecasts the funding formulas built into the state budget. And that's primarily in K-12 and in Medicaid. And so that's one aspect of what we do. The second is we take the instructions from the legislature in the last budget, because every year we do a 3-year budget, and we only appropriate for 1 year, but we make projections for the second and the third year. And part of that is the legislature saying what spending should remain in the base and what should be taken out of the base. So we follow both of those instructions. One is the formula funding, and that's the box on the left-hand side. And you'll see there that formula spending is projected to grow by about $727 million. The primary growth factors are Medicaid and the first and the fourth line. You'll see that's up by about $350 million. K-12 is projected to grow by about $200 million. And then don't forget, we repealed the highway safety fee, that $32 fee, a year ago. And that is set to expire in this upcoming June. So we're going to have to backfill DPS's general operating costs because they're no longer going to have the highway safety fee of $160 million of revenue. So that would be backfilled with general fund money. And that adds to probably an extra boost in statutory funding formula spending that we wouldn't normally have. On the right-hand side, and I'm not going to cover a lot of this, but you see sort of the one-time adjustments. Now, there is one positive one-time adjustment, and that is a couple of years ago, we decided to reduce the rollover by $30 million in K-12. So remember, the rollover still exists, and it's going down from, it will go down in 22 from $930 million to $900 million. But let me give you an example of some of this one-time spending is really ongoing one-time spending, meaning every year the legislature designates it as one time, we back it out in the baseline, and then it ends up being added back by the time we finish the appropriation process. And so the best example of that, I think, is the fourth item, which is the school facility board building repair grants to the tune of, we permanently fund in the base about $17 million, and then there's $91 million of one-time spending. I definitely think that that is going to be a primary candidate that will end up being restored during the budget process. But when you put all of this together, it shows that spending would increase by about 5% or $564 million which would get us to the level of about $12.3 billion in fiscal 22. So having talked about revenues and having talked about spending, I now want to talk about our ending balances. And before we go on to the next slide, just want to make a comment that anything I say from this point forward does not include the budget stabilization, AKA the rainy day fund. So that's a separate pot of money that is not part of the general fund balance. And right now we have about $970 million in the rainy day fund, which are not reflected in the numbers I'm about to talk about. So let's turn our attention to the year that we're currently in, fiscal 21. So I said at the beginning of the presentation, our projected balance from our October estimates was $411 million. I've already mentioned we think that number is too low. And just one example of that, or evidence of that, is that to achieve that level of $411 million, revenue would only need to grow by 1.5% between now and June to match the October forecast. One of the reasons why we think that come January, we will have enough evidence to up the forecast on the revenue side. But there are also some significant factors on the spending side that everybody needs to be aware of. Our numbers do not reflect any match rate savings for Medicaid in 21. And they could be as great as 190 million. And the reason we haven't reflected that is because Access is planning to increase its provider rates above the budgeted rates this year. And we don't know what that's going to be yet. That's information that Access is supposed to be transmitting to us shortly. And so once that happens, we'll be in a better position to estimate how much, if any, of the 190 million still will remain available. And then finally, there's also a significant factor in K-12. We are, as not surprising, there are fewer students in the system. And in addition, there are more students taking online courses right now in the K-12 system in distance learning, virtual learning. Everyone who learns virtually or online, districts only get 95 cents on the dollar for those students. So you have a combination of both additional online learning, as well as potentially some parents having taken their children out of the system entirely and are not relying, for example, on ESAs, that could generate some savings. Now, we don't really have a great handle on that amount. There have been published estimates that enrollment is down by 5%. And that's a good starting point, but we're not really confident yet of that number. And it's going to take a while for those numbers to stabilize somewhat. And so we might have a better perspective on that by January, or it may take into February or March. But having said that K-12 is going to potentially give back some of its general fund money does not mean it's going to overall lose net resources. And as a result, to make that point, I want to display the next chart on the next slide with regard to something called at the federal level, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, CRF. That's a function of the CARES Act back in March. And it gave the state, along with every other state, it gave Arizona specifically $1.8 billion. And those resources are entirely under the control of the executive. The legislature does not have a role in allocating these funds. So one of the allocation decisions that the executive made was that third line down on the left, which was a K-12 enrollment stability grant of $370 million. That is intended to offset any of the general fund loss from lower enrollment. And the grant program would guarantee you, even if you only had 90% of your last year's students, it's going to guarantee you 98%. And in a number of cases, districts will actually earn more than they earned a year ago. And so overall support for K-12 will increase above last year when you combine both whatever they have to give back because of lower funding formula offset by the increase from the federal funds. And this doesn't even take into account something called the K-12 Relief Fund and the Governor's Education Relief Fund. Again, both functions of the CARES grant that are not part of the CRF. That adds another $270 million over and above the numbers you see displayed on this chart. The other point I would make is that, if you could go back, Jeff, that there's about we had indicated that there's $1.459 billion, and we gave ATRA this chart on Thursday or on Tuesday. But even yesterday, the governor just allocated another $25 million that is not reflected in this chart. It's going to go to hospitals to help them with overtime funding for their staff. There remains about $400 million left unallocated in the fund, and the executive has indicated that they are interested in putting that funding, some of that remaining funding, into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. The trust fund is being depleted of its funding. It's going to be probably out of funding, I would say, in the next month or so. And you can then borrow from the feds, but you're going to eventually have to pay that back, and it's going to end up being a higher employer rate, tax rate, in order to replenish the fund. And so any monies that go into this from that purpose might reduce that. So again, those are all decisions being made at this point by the executive. Having talked about 21, I now want to turn to 22. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we projected in October that the balance would be $93 million. Now, just to sort of bring together in one place, in one slide, the themes I've been talking about so far, that number is the factors that are likely to increase that. One is that the 21 ending balance will be higher than 411 million, and that's going to roll over into 22. Secondly, because the revenue base in 21 is higher than we thought, that means the revenue base in 22 is going to be higher than what was originally used in the October numbers. We've got the open issues of whether or not the federal Medicaid match rate is going to be extended into 22, and whether or not there's going to be another federal relief package, which, you know, from what you hear out of DC, that likely is not going to be acted on until early next year, but we'll see what happens. Couple of points: you could get more federal direct aid, meaning like more money into something like the CRF. And secondly, you could get more indirect aid, for example, more PPP. And to the extent that that happens and that injects additional liquidity into the system, then businesses are out there purchasing materials and supplies and increasing our sales tax collection. So that's an indirect impact of any additional federal aid. And again, we need to be cognizant of keeping our eye on COVID, what's happening with that, and as well, any continuing of the one-time 21 initiatives that we've backed out could also reduce the balance. But on net, we think that number is going to be positive. And then obviously the question is how much could it be positive by? Well, I think we are, and this is not surprising, we're living in extraordinarily uncertain times. And so I think we need to keep our eye on the virus. We need to keep our eye on holiday sales. We need to keep our eye on Congress, all of which are factors that aren't entirely under our control. But having said that, I think, could that number go up? Could this balance number, by the time we get to January, go up 400 million, 600 million, maybe even 800 million? Yeah, it could be in that range. And again, we'll be continuing over the course of the next 6 to 7 weeks, continuing to review those numbers carefully before, and all those factors before we release our estimates in January. Then I want to close by just talking about the ballot props. You know, we do fiscal notes, we do estimates of how much the ballot props cost. So given that those both passed, just want to make brief comments about both of them. Prop 207, ongoing programs funded by an excise tax, a 16% excise tax. When we were doing our fiscal note research, we realized that a lot of states have a lot of different ramp up periods in terms of the bringing on recreational marijuana. So our estimates here, $160 million is what could happen in the third year. Could happen more quickly than that. What is not as uncertain is the distributions from the medical marijuana fund. You'll see on the right-hand side that the ballot proposition specifically transfers 45 million out of the medical marijuana fund, which cuts its balance in about half, and gives it to Teachers Academy, Highway Safety, and Health Services. Then finally, in Prop 208, we forecasted that revenue growth at about $827 million. You'll see there the K-12 recipients of that money, but also note that Teachers Academy also would receive additional money out of both 208 as well as 207. And then finally, my other observation on 208 is that because this is based on tax year 21 liability and taxpayers won't be filing until the spring of 21, till the spring of 22, we think that these resources may not actually be available to the K-12 system until fiscal 23. And then the final slide is just the sort of technical slide that shows you all the forecasts from all the different components. But with that, I think we do have some extra time. So I would be glad to answer any questions if any have come in while I was speaking. So thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Richard, for that outstanding presentation. I couldn't help but think about how dramatic the difference the message is today versus where it was back in the spring, and how bad things look. So that was actually quite a lot of good news, I think. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. One from a lawmaker asking whether or not you've been able to drill into the increased TPT collections relative to Wayfair, and how much of the new, you noted on the slide that it was sales tax and remote sales. Is there any way to identify how much of that is remote sales versus the existing sales tax collections?
There is and there isn't, which is a typical economist answer. There is, because there is now a new remote category that you have to, if you are doing these remote sales, you fall under that specific category. And that number is up substantially. For example, in just the first quarter of the fiscal year, it was up over $60 million. So I got to think throughout the course of the whole year, it could be up by over $200 million, $250 million. But what we don't know is how many of the remote sales was in the retail category in a prior year. So you can't necessarily say that all of that is new, because, you know, some of our Amazon purchases before October of 2019 were getting sales tax levied on them, for example. But nonetheless, on net, I do think it's higher than what we anticipated.
Very good. Another question that came in is in the K-12 area. One of your slides, I think, indicated that there was $370 million that was appropriated to the K-12s for stability purposes. Last session, there was quite a bit of discussion about the K-12 community, the K-12 schools being at the aggregate expenditure limit. And I think that they're in fact over the limit as we proceed through FY21. How does that 370 impact that whole calculation with the expenditure limitation?
I'm not 100% positive about this, Kevin. I think that those federal funds would not necessarily factor into the aggregate expenditure limit. We agree with you that the aggregate expenditure limit will be exceeded. The legislature, if it wants to not cut K-12 funding, will need to take action on that by, I believe it's March 1st, in order to provide at least some one-time exemption from the AEL.
Okay, very good. The last question I think you've answered relative to Prop 208, it was timing. And so to repeat for this, the person that asked the question, you're saying that the proceeds from 208 likely won't kick in until fiscal 23, just from the sheer timing issues.
Correct, Kevin. I mean, we need to see more guidance from DOR on that topic, but it's hard to envision exactly until people file how you deposit money into that K-12 fund. But again, that could be subject to further DOR guidance.
Very good. And a couple minutes left. We just had a question. What behavior changes might you be anticipating as a result from filing standpoint? I think the question's getting at from Prop 208.
I think that that raises the possibility of whether or not some existing individual income tax filers in terms of LLCs might change their status to corporate status in order to take advantage of our lower corporate rate than the rate that we're going to be charging at the upper ends with the surcharge. Now, again, that's not a simple calculation to make, because you also have to factor in your federal tax liability. But to me, that is one potential behavioral change. Then the second much debated one is what does that do in terms of location of high-income individuals and their desire to locate in Arizona versus they're not going to move to California, obviously, but would they move elsewhere? And I think there's a lot of different opinions about that. The academic research is mixed. And part of it is, as with a lot of major changes to our system, you just have to sort of see what happens and have that play into everything else that's happening in the world at the time. For example, if it were being implemented right, do people want to relocate in the middle of a pandemic? Maybe not. But maybe once that eases, maybe people are more willing to. So you can't sort of, I think, view it in isolation of just the tax rate itself. There's a lot of factors that I think swirl around location decisions.
Very good, thank you. We'll close this portion of the program. I want to thank you again for joining us and second Richard's remarks and introduction. I think few people understand what a treasure and asset you are to the state of Arizona with your knowledge of the state budget. The legislature can call on a dime and get an answer to anything that happens related to the budget, and helps us keep us out of a lot of trouble that otherwise might occur. So on behalf of taxpayers, we appreciate all the great work that you do. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right. We will move on. The next portion of the program is an economic outlook from economist Jim Rounds, and to do the honors to introducing Mr. Rounds is our senior research analyst, Sean McCarthy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sean McCarthy, and I am Senior Research Analyst at ATRA. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Jim Rounds, who is the president of Rounds Consulting Group. The firm specializes in economic development and tax policy analysis, education research, and fiscal planning, including revenue forecasting and budget development. Mr. Rounds began his career as a senior economist and senior budget analyst at JLBC, and has been engaged in policy-related economics for more than 2 decades. Jim has a Bachelor of Science degree and a Master of Science degree in economics from ASU. Jim Rounds will provide an analysis on the health and direction of the Arizona economy. Welcome, Jim, and you can take it from here.
Thanks, and good morning, everybody. I still have to say that my former mentor, Richard, is still the only person that I am nervous to go after giving a presentation because he's so thorough, and the economic presentations by JLBC are as good as any that are out there. But I'll try to cover some interesting information in this PowerPoint. What I'd like to cover is a little bit on the US economy. Let's get into the Arizona economy in the metro areas and the rural areas. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about risks and opportunities, because I believe now more than ever, after analyzing various things related to education, the voter initiatives, things like that, that public policy has a pretty dramatic impact on economic well-being. It's like that sport of curling where the stone going down the ice is that main economy, but the little sweepers can make the stone go to the left or the right, or can speed it up or slow it down. And that's what policymakers are. They're the sweepers, but it's a vital role. Let's talk about, I'm just going to include the main points. If I covered everything that we normally look at, it'd be a 250 slide presentation, and people don't like to listen to economists for more than 5 slides normally. But if you take a look at real GDP, we had that dramatic reduction, and then we had this tremendous growth. Well, you have to be careful with looking at the most recent data when you look at percentages. And this gets back to that issue of if you fall by 50%, you got to grow by 100% just to get back to where you were before. Even though we had the strong GDP growth in the third quarter, it still didn't get us back to where we were at the end of the last calendar year. And the reason that we didn't see as much of a negative impact on state tax collections and some of the federal activity is because we had this huge growth in personal income in the second quarter, which then declined a little bit. The second quarter had to do with all of the stimulus monies that were out there. And so the stimulus had a definite impact on the economy. However, a word of caution is that artificially lifted where we otherwise would have been. If we don't have the continuation of a stimulus at that level, you would have to expect that some of the economic activity could slow a bit. And that's one of my concerns for the state. If we see slower activity, you're going to see things like eating through the rainy day fund much more rapidly than others are expecting, because we didn't have to utilize it that much up until this point. But even though I have a very rosy forecast for the state, I'm very optimistic about this next year, and I'll be covering why. I'm still concerned that we're going to need to use those resources, and we have to be very careful with it. If you look at U.S. leading indicators, there's a theme that's developing. If you look on the January 20 part of the slide, we had a significant fall in economic activity because the economy was basically shut down. Then we went through a period where the economy slowly reopened about maybe 50% or so. We gained about half the jobs back that were lost. And then we're going to kind of just chug along at a modest pace going forward. And that's because we can't fully open until we can better manage what's happening with COVID-19. And so this is why it's a little misleading if you try to make trends out of the last couple of quarters. But I have some approaches that we use that I think you can use too. Take care looking at the unemployment and the underemployment rates. When you look at unemployment, you hear a story about how the unemployment rate may have gone up. Well, it may be a situation where the economy starts to improve and you have people that previously gave up looking for work that start to look for work again. They get added in the equation. They don't have jobs yet. The unemployment rate goes up even though the economy is improving. And when the economy is weakening and you have people give up and say, I'm not going to look again for another 6 months or a year, the unemployment rate gets better even though it's weakening. So this is an okay measure to look at for a longer term trend, but I put absolutely no weight on month-to-month changes, and I'd recommend the same. If you look at job losses by sector, it's pretty consistent across the country. And in Arizona, we had a pretty significant loss in leisure and hospitality, natural resources and mining, but we didn't have as much of a decrease in the high wage industries or occupations. And so this recession was very different from what we've seen before. And this poses additional public policy problems as we go into the next couple of years. So what's the shape of the recession? Everybody likes to talk about whether or not it's a V-shaped recession. A W would be a double dip. It means you go into a recession, you come out of it, then you go into it again. Some people think it's going to look like that Nike swoosh where you fall far and it's going to take 3 or 4 years to get back to where we were before, or a U-shaped recession, which is you fall far, you just kind of tread water for a couple of years and then you come back up. Well, my best guess is a V-shaped with a hitch. And this matches the other economic data. And as you saw in the charts, where you fall far, you partly reopen the economy, and that's going to take a little while to get back to the previous levels of employment and other economic activity. The only way that we would have a double dip is if we had no stimulus package and we had increasing rates of the virus getting spread, which we're already seeing, and we were able to show that we came out of the recession towards the end of this calendar year. Now, I don't think that we're coming out of it, so I think that the double dip is not likely, but the concept of the double dip is still valid. We might see some weaker activity on the front end. But this is the main thing. The recession is done the month that we see the wide distribution of a vaccine. This is a public policy-based recession because we had to respond to the health issues. We still had another couple of years left in the expansion before we were going to go into a recession. And so based on what we've been reading so far and chatting with people to try to find out what's real and what's not, it looks like we will see some distribution of the vaccine in the first half of the next calendar year. And it's going to be going initially to the higher risk individuals, so the death rate is going to be slowing. But the fact that we're going to have that optimism is going to allow for employment to get boosted even before the vaccine is fully distributed to everybody. And so my best guess is that the recession ends sometime in the first quarter, end of the first quarter, beginning of the second, based on how quickly we can get the vaccines distributed to the public. And then within 6 months to a year after that, we'll be back to previous levels of employment. This is going to be a very quick recovery once we have a handle on COVID. And so more than any other economic data point that you look at, tracking what's happening to the vaccine is the most important thing to follow. Let's talk about the state briefly. This is what I was talking about earlier. When you decline by 50%, you got to grow by 100% to get back to where you were. And I always like to use this example. If you have $1 and you lose 50%, you only have 50 cents left. What does that 50 cents have to do to get back to that buck that you previously had? You got to double it. So the percentages, when you have a dramatic decline in activity, have to be even stronger to get back to where you were before. So sometimes the percentages can lie. If you take a look at the second quarter, I don't think the third quarter is out with just yet. Arizona GDP versus the rest of the U.S., 25% decline for Arizona. But again, it was about 35% decline or 31.4% decline for the U.S. But we were still in that upper echelon of still declining, but performing better than everybody else types of states. And this is a theme that we're seeing in other data. And if you take a look at, I like to look at year-to-date numbers for each month, because if you look at one particular month over the prior year and you compare it to other states, different states had different shutdown rates and different opening of the economy rates. But if you look at the year-to-date growth as of August, we're number 3, but we're behind Idaho, which is a very small economy. So really we are number 2 behind Utah if you consider competitors. In September, it was the same issue. If you go back to the prior 2 months, we also were top 5. So on the surface, we're doing well in terms of job growth, but what we have to pick up a little bit is on the quality of the job growth that we have. We need higher wage jobs if we're going to overcome some of the fiscal issues that might arise over the next decade or two. And to put it into context, the question was asked, since we lost about the same number of jobs during this recession initially as we did during the Great Recession, is it going to look the same? Well, the difference is that job recovery for the U.S. in Arizona for the Great Recession, it took 101 months. That was really like an extended Nike swoosh recovery. This time we're looking at 16 to 24 months likely, but again, a lot of it depends on the distribution of the vaccine. We're about 60-65% recovered. There's more data that came out today, but I didn't have a chance to look at it before this event. So we might be a little bit further recovered, but it's in the 60s. The U.S. was at 50%, so we're outperforming the U.S. And this is just a visual portrayal of the 2008 recession in terms of how long it took to get the jobs back. And even under the most pessimistic scenario, which is going out 3 years for job recovery, it's still just a fraction of what we saw before. And so the economic problems, when you look at these charts, it's the area under the flat line and above the curve. So that whole area that encompasses that red line going up to the pre-recession peak, that's the pain of the economic downturn. The pain of the economic downturn is the area. And in this case, I'm very optimistic it's going to be on the shorter side of this. So ultimately, this is going to look like one of the worst recessions we've ever had, but it's going to end up being relatively short given the depth that we fell, and there's some reasons for that. This is where I worry the most. People with higher wage jobs did a good job of maintaining those jobs. The lower wage individuals were the ones that were really hit because we were hit in a lot of restaurant and bars, tourism activity, a lot of the service sector type jobs that tend to pay lower wages. And this is one of the reasons, another reason, it's not just a stimulus, but another reason that we've been seeing strong growth in certain categories, additional home buying, things like that, is because a large portion of those with higher wages still are employed and are making similar money. Now, if this was an extended downturn, you would start to see the higher wage jobs being lost. And that would make it extremely painful on the lower wage jobs, because typically the base sector jobs are the higher wage jobs, and that creates the demand for the restaurant and bars and the other employees. And so this is an indicator to me that it's a problem for those with lower incomes. It's a problem for those with lower education levels. And I think some of the areas in the economy where you can fine tune, like unemployment insurance levels and things like that, housing affordability issues, we have to maybe think about those longer term. Now, you don't want to go through and completely break a budget by trying to fix everything all at once, but I think we can be intelligent with this. And Richard addressed it perfectly, that there may end up needing to be some employer cost as part of the getting that unemployment insurance fund back on its feet. But also keep in mind, after we come out of this downturn, I still believe we're going to have one of the strongest expansions in our state's history. There's going to be a lot of general fund revenue that's going to come in if we have some good public policy planning the next 2 or 3 years. And I'll cover a couple of examples later. Job losses by sector: leisure and hospitality, 140,000 lost jobs. But we saw jobs being lost everywhere. But here's what's telling. This indicates that leisure and hospitality is leading all sectors in job recovery, but it's just a little more than 50% recovered. And there's probably going to be some delay in terms of when we're going to fully be recovered, because there's going to be not as much there's pent-up demand for travel, but people aren't going to be able to take 2 vacations if their job only allows them to take 1. And so these other individuals have also been spending their money on maybe getting a new TV instead of going somewhere, or buying some other items, and that's helped prop sales tax collections. So leisure and hospitality, it looks like it's a strong recovery, but it's going to stall a little bit for some time to come. And some of the other sectors have actually fully recovered. Greater Phoenix, it's basically the same story as for Arizona. We had a 97-month downturn after the Great Recession in terms of job recovery, not just the identifying of the recession. And we're looking at even better performance in the state as a whole. This is what I worry about. This is one of the biggest public policy problems that I'm concerned about right now. Normally, when you see home values increase, it's a good thing if it's for the right reasons. If we have people moving here because we're creating jobs at a decent pace or at a high rate like we normally do, and we're seeing incomes going up, we're seeing the entire economy being lifted, and that pushes home prices up, that's a good thing. When you have a shortage of supply, you have such a dramatic reduction in economic activity where interest rates had to get lowered very much, and we still have have and have nots type of economic recession where a lot of people are able to take advantage of it. We have investors purchasing homes. So what we're seeing is these prices are going up partly because of some underlying demand, but maybe half or more is because of imbalances. And so what we got to do is figure out what we can do about this. Housing is expensive. The problems are widespread. Housing programs are difficult to monetize and show a positive return on investment, but we may have to put a little bit of money in the housing trust fund going forward. That's at least what I'm recommending, but we have to be able to show that it's going to be used for the right purposes. If you take a look at, this is the most critical slide for our future. If you just take a look at Greater Phoenix, you look at the per capita personal income as a percentage of the US, and it's been declining over time. We had a little boost due to that artificial spike in the economy from housing in 2006, but it's been dropping over time to about 85% of the US average. Now, we did some analysis where we took a look at our economic development competitors, but we adjusted for cost of living, we adjusted for a portion of the workforce, portion of the population that's in the workforce. We made a number of adjustments and different calculations. And the 2 things that I want to note is that this is more like the game of golf, where it's okay if you have a buddy that's better than you. In fact, that actually helps your game. But you want to play against yourself. You want to do better than you did the prior round. So if you look at the Phoenix area historically, we're on the cusp of being able to do better than we did the prior round, but we're not quite there. The thing that concerns me, though, is when you compare us to a lot of our economic development competitors, and I don't have these in this presentation, but I've had them in others, we're lagging. There's things that we need to do, and this is another reason why things like Prop 208 or any other policy issues that arise, we're going to have to be very, very careful with managing. Tucson, it looks the same. It's just at a smaller scale. I'm more optimistic about Tucson than I was a couple of years ago, because I'm starting to see some coordination between the new administration at U of A and the community and the tech park and others, and then integrating it into Pinal County and helping to develop the whole corridor between Tucson and Phoenix. They're going to reap some good economic benefits from this, but they're still hurting in the same areas. If you look at the balance of the state, it's very different by county. Now, you can't necessarily just look at the percent change in employment because there's different stories happening. Like, for example, in Pinal, they're actually doing quite well in terms of bringing in new businesses, but a lot of their folks live in Pinal but work in Maricopa County. And so it's overstating the extent that Pinal County lost jobs because how it's tabulated. Coconino County, so the Flagstaff area, is leading all others in terms of job losses. If you look at leisure and hospitality, it's almost the same story. Coconino down by 50%. There's different reasons why you see different counties performing when you look at them in the proper way. One of my biggest concerns about one of my favorite communities, Flagstaff, is the minimum wage going to the $15.50. And while we're still going through tough economic times and then escalating, what you have to think about, and minimum wage is going to be coming up a lot in the future, what we have to think about is putting things in comparable terms. It's a bad idea to simply say everybody should have a $15 an hour minimum wage. If you take a look at the $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle or San Francisco or some other areas, Arizona's $12 an hour is already above that after you adjust for cost of living. And so it would be to a disadvantage of certain communities to take it to 15, and it'll help others be competitive if it's at 15. And so what's happening with Coconino is that the minimum wage there, the $15.50, is equivalent of about, I think it was $25 to $30 an hour versus what Seattle actually implemented, and about the same in San Francisco. So you have to do the math on the front end. We can't just generalize and say it's too complicated, and I'm spending too much time on this topic, but this is something that is going to come back again and again and again, and we have to do the math and the analysis to make sure we don't do something stupid. So what can be done? We have to continue to keep in mind that a lot of things drive economic growth. And so you typically see those in individual industries think that that is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of the state, where really there's a lot of things that impact economic growth. You have to be competitive in tax rates. You don't have to have the lowest tax rates, but you have to be competitive. You have to have good economic development programs, but they have to be smartly constructed. The workforce quality is important. So you go down the list. So a lot of things move economic growth. And so that means usually one thing won't derail the economy, but even slightly slowing economic activity in one particular area, such as 208, could have dramatic consequences. We did some analysis, and it identified that we are going to lose about 125,000 jobs in the first 10 years. And that was our most optimistic scenario, and I think it was about $2.5 billion in state and local tax collections. How did we get there? We didn't completely gut the forecast for Arizona growing. We reduced the rate of growth from 1.7% to 1.6%. The economic development community doing extensive interviews, talking with site selectors, doing research. They were estimating that new business recruitment was going to go down by about 25%. We used 15%. So when you go across the board and you make minor changes in economic growth, you get huge economic implications. We are going to see fewer businesses locate here, but we are going to still see businesses locate here. And this is why public policy going forward over the next 3 years is so critical. I would love to see a recovery package 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 in each of the next 3 years. And once we get through this downturn, I think we're going to have a great opportunity to be making additional money with the right public policy implementation now, and we'll be able to fund other things down the road. But we first have to get through this downturn. Just really quickly, these are the things that we've been seeing that are being discussed: the unemployment insurance, criminal justice reform. We analyzed. We were the ones that did the math on the initiative that got pulled from the ballot, but we had about $1.5 billion in state savings over 10 years. Well, if we implement maybe a portion of that or a form of that, even if it's only $1 billion in savings, if we can implement that during the legislative session, that's $1 billion that we could use for other programs to help shore up the economy. Housing affordability, I think probably the easiest is a housing trust fund, replenish those monies a bit. But on economic development, what are we going to do with tax policy? How are we going to help those small businesses that might be struggling a little bit? Extension of executive orders. I was just tweeting that The court ruling about the alcohol delivery by the restaurants no longer being allowed probably just caused another 100 restaurants and small businesses to go under, because if you do a pro forma for restaurants, basically what makes them the profit, unless they have huge volume, is liquor sales. Well, that costs nothing, but it could shore up the economic recovery for small businesses, which we have to pay attention to. And then there's other areas. We're big supporters of the new economy issue, but only because of how the Board of Regents has been promoting it. And this is how we have to start thinking about government spending. We have to think about return on investment. Now, in some cases, you have social programs where it's about doing the right thing and helping individuals. But when it's workforce and it's economic related, we have policymakers that say we want government to be operating like a business. Well, I spend money in my business, other people spend money in their businesses, and they look for a return on investment, a certain return on investment over a certain period of time. We have to think in terms of return on investment going forward much more. I'll skip the rest. The political unknowns, we still have issues related to the presidential election. How is Biden going to be different than Trump? Things like that. So there's still a lot of unknowns and you got to be careful. So it's good to budget and plan on the conservative side, but I'm still very, very bullish on where we're going forward. And so we're still a good solid bet, but I really, really think we need a legit recovery package in each of the next 3 years and make it different for each one. And again, this ends the month the vaccine is widely distributed. This is the best economic indicator that's out there, is just tracking that information. And that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Jim. We appreciate all that information. We got a couple of questions here. One from Gretchen Kitchell at APS. She asked, what is the long-term behavior changes that you see as a result of the pandemic, such as more folks working from home, and how do you think that changes will alter the Arizona economy?
I think we're going to see additional small business development. I think we're going to see more work people on a contract basis. I think we're going to see less square foot per person in terms of office. Industrial is a different story. That's usually more hands-on. So I think it's going to be similar to the Great Recession, where everybody thought, okay, this is just temporary, but there was a shift to more multifamily, smaller homes that caused people to reevaluate how they wanted to manage their lives going forward. I think we're going to have something similar, but we're going to learn from this, and I think we can benefit from it if we do the right planning.
Great. We had another question, and I apologize. Gretchen is with SRP, not APS. Representative Pamela Powers-Hanley from Tucson asks, in your slide about Tucson, you mentioned that Tucson lost more information sector jobs than hospitality jobs, and she was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. And so when the size of a community increases, you end up seeing the percentages that tell a story that makes a little bit more sense. When a community is large, but kind of in that mid-range, like the Tucson area, you might have an industry with a smaller footprint for in a particular area. And so you see bigger changes in terms of percentages. So a better slide for this might be for next time I have to give a speech, is to show the number of lost jobs. And then it'll put it into context. So again, this is where percentages can sometimes lie. But if you're a policymaker in the Tucson area, this is an exciting time. There's lots of things you could do to help stabilize that economy and have smart economic development going forward. And a lot of it's not going to cost much. It's going to be coordination based with the university and the business community. And if you ever want to talk about that, give me a buzz.
Great, thank you. We had a question from Brad Scott up in Prescott, who was wondering about the impacts of the new Wayfair laws nationwide and their impact on small and medium-sized businesses that have interstate clientele. Are we seeing any early indications of the impact on those small businesses that sell remotely, who now have to manage the complex nexus laws in the various states? I know it's early, it's really only been maybe a year since that began, but obviously it's a huge change in the way these businesses operate. Curious if there's any early indications of those impacts.
Well, to be honest, the best summary of what was going to happen was from ATRA. You all talked about the Wayfair case and covered the potential downsides and the complexity, and I thought that was very good, and we're seeing some consistent reports in other states about how it's just very difficult for small businesses. When you're a small business, you typically, the owners do a lot of work. The owner is the person that changes the lights, changes the toner in the printer, and does, vacuums the carpet on occasion when they need to. They don't have time for a lot of this other stuff. But from my perspective, the fiscal gains outweigh that. Again, it's just my personal perspective, because I feel like we need that money to maybe help invest in those areas where we might start to become out of balance, like if it's in tax policy or something else. So I welcome the money coming in, but I think that we can also help these small businesses manage through some of these difficult times. And what they're going through right now is far more difficult than the Wayfair issue, but you can only carry so much weight. Sometimes you just put another brick in the barrel and it's too much to lift, and that could be the case.
Great. Jim, I know the media and folks in our industry, we like to focus on the big, landings of major companies and the big expansions. And we've had a lot of them in the last couple of years. That, we've had a lot in the insurance industry, like Nationwide up in North Scottsdale. There's been a lot in Pinal County, like Lucid, Nikola. We've got major investments from Apple and Google, Taiwan Semiconductor. And those types of things draw a lot of policy attention. How can we do more of that? Is that a good thing to focus on those big guys and those big landings? Or is that really kind of just missing, larger movements, or those, smaller ripples in the ocean? What's your view on those large movements, and how much policymakers should focus on those?
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can focus on building the core of the economy and the foundation in an intelligent way, and we can try to recruit entrepreneurs that are going to start small businesses that are going to grow into big businesses, and also recruit big businesses. But it reminds me of the first time that I gave my son, when he was maybe 5 years old, a hammer, and I held the nail and he smacked me on the toe. The hammer wasn't bad, it was just how it was being used. And so I didn't throw the hammer out. I eventually taught him how to use the hammer properly. And so what I'm seeing with a lot of communities and a lot of economic developers is they want more tools, but in a lot of cases, they don't fully understand how to use them. So I have no problem with having tools in the toolbox, but I do have a problem when they're misused. And in a lot of cases at the state level, they're very careful. They have a very short time frame to show a return on investment. It was drafted really well. They focus on higher wage jobs. Other communities, they'll go out 20 years on a project that should be analyzed over 5 years, and they're giving away the farm, and taxpayers are ultimately suffering. And so we really need to focus on the high wage jobs, but we have to be smart about it. Let's keep a toolbox. Let's make sure people understand how to use it. How do we get there? I don't know, because I've been ranting about this for several years now, and I don't know if I even made a dent in the issue.
Thanks, Jimmy. I know that's a complex topic. You talked a lot about making smart decisions. A lot of these incentives for landing new jobs or new businesses are done at the local level. Do you have maybe an example of a recent one in the last few years where you thought that was a good example of not giving away the farm, or making a smart investment that didn't abuse taxpayers, but did a good job of making that area business friendly, or an incentive that made sense?
I won't pick any specifically, but there are certain communities. The way that the economic development team works with the policymakers in Chandler and Gilbert, I think has been solid over the years. Peoria is doing a good job. Phoenix does a good job on occasion, but I disagree with some of their policies on incentives in other cases. But I think what I'm finding, since I know a lot of these folks, is that it's not always just them not understanding the math. Quite often the policymakers within the communities want to get deals closed, and the direction will come from up above. And I think if we can educate policymakers more on economic development incentives, on economics as a whole, that will help the staff be able to sometimes say this isn't a good project. Because I do know for sure that there are some of my colleagues that have had to support a project, and they had to call me and vent about having to support it because it ruined their day because it went against everything they believed in. But when your boss is a policymaker and really wants something, you have to put it through. I think we need to better educate the policymakers at the city just as much as we have to have economic forums and how economic development works and economic incentives are calculated and the best practices for staff. I'd like to see it for both.
Great, thank you, Jim. Well, we're right on time and appreciate all your thoughts. So at this point in the program, we are going to take a 15-minute break. We will be back at 10 sharp.
Welcome back to the 220 Arizona Tax Research Association Outlook Conference. I hope you're enjoying the conference. It just dawned on me there is at least one benefit to having a virtual conference as opposed to an in-person conference, that is crowd control. We immediately moved from the break right back into the conference, and I'm not required to tell 5 lobbyists to leave Senator Leach alone in the back of the room so he can return to his seat. So there's some benefit to the virtual approach. Each year, the Arizona Tax Research Association staff uses the occasion of our conference to highlight major tax issues that we think policymakers should consider, be thinking about, and certainly things that we have come across through our research. And so today what we are going to do is talk a lot about property taxes, current property tax trends, talk about the recap of 117 and where that's at, and I'll give you the explanation why we're going to spend some time on that, as well as the growth in K-12 secondary levies and its implications on capital spending and litigation, and then finally the Prop 208 postmortem. Before I turn it over to staff, I want to give a little bit of a background on the Prop 117 recap, because for those of you that are relatively new to public policy and politics in Arizona, I think it's important for you to know what the lens is that Prop 117 was put in place, was through. In the earlier part of this century, in 2005 through 2009, property tax valuations were skyrocketing in Arizona. ATRA pursued some reforms at the Capitol to see what we could do to mitigate dramatic growth in property values, both in centrally assessed, locally assessed property. We put together a package at the legislature. There was a combination of reducing tax rates at the state level that would dampen the growth in property taxes overall, as well as a referral to the ballot of a measure that would, what we called, reboot the levy limits in Arizona. By that, I mean that we went into the levy limitations that were then 25 years old and stripped the excess capacity that had built up over time. That excess capacity guaranteed that it would lead to, the growth in values would lead to significant increases in taxes. Fortunately, the legislature not only adopted the reducing of the tax rates, they referred Prop 101 to the ballot, and we were successful in getting that measure adopted by Arizona voters. Interestingly enough, we came out of that exercise and it didn't seem to dampen at all the interest on the part of some Arizonans to impose a Prop 13 style property tax system on Arizona property taxpayers. That effort manifested itself both at the state level in an attempt to have that referred to the voters, as well as an initiative that was spread by the citizens. And we were successful in repeated efforts actually to defeat a referral to put a Prop 13 system in place. The reason we opposed it, quite frankly, was that it would, in addition to, we think, make our current system that has a lot of inequities built into it even worse, with some of the inherent inequities associated with Prop 13's acquisition value approach to valuing property. Moreover, it would have done cataclysmic damage to our public finance system. Any of those proposals stripped roughly half of all the property taxes that were being levied out of the system. We didn't see any way the state would recover from that kind of, state and local governments would recover from those measures. However, in our efforts to beat back Prop 13, many policymakers told us that the current system that allowed for unlimited growth in values, there were secondary property taxes, and all of that value subject to tax in any given year. So if residential values grew at 60% in any given year, which they did, they were subject to a 60% increase in taxes if a city or a school didn't decrease the tax rate. They told us that was untenable, and if we didn't want Prop 13 referred at the legislative level, then we needed to fix this problem. And so we set out in doing that and had referred in 2012 to the ballot Prop 117 that capped evaluation growth at 5% and only made the limited value taxable. We think that it was the right answer at the right time. In some people's eyes, the jury is still out on whether or not that was the right answer to the problem, and whether or not we should have picked 2% growth versus 5% growth in value. Others were arguing for higher amounts. We settled on 5. So we set a marker in our calendar to use 2020 as the 5-year look back on when it went into effect in 2015. 2020 is the 5-year look back. And so ATRA Vice President Jennifer Stilo has done considerable research on what the effect has been and whether we accomplished the goals we were seeking to set out back in 2012 when we succeeded in getting it passed. So Jennifer.
Good morning. Let me get rid of this right here. Okay. I'd like to start out by just giving you a quick overview of what our property tax system looked like prior to 117, and then walk you through how well the system has performed since 117 has been put in place. So prior to 117, Arizona's property tax system was considered one of the most complicated in the country. That's because we had 2 taxable values. We had the full cash value, which of course was supposed to represent market value, and full cash value we saw grew by unlimited amounts and dramatic amounts during the real estate boom. We also have the limited property value. There is a 2-part calculation with the LPV. The LPV could grow by either 10% over the previous year or 25% of the difference between the current year full cash value and prior year limited, whichever was greater. So that was an area that when the real estate boom occurred, we saw that was an area that we need to control the growth, that there were flaws in our system. So in 2012, voters passed 117. That went into effect in tax year 2015. With 117, the full cash value is no longer the taxable value. However, we still have the LPV, and that amount grows by 5% a year. So some of the goals that we wanted to accomplish with 117 was to insulate taxpayers from dramatic swings in their tax bills due to major fluctuations in the real estate market. Again, that's what we saw during the real estate boom. We also wanted to simplify the tax system. So we went from that dual tax structure to that single taxable value, which again is the LPV and grows at just 5%. And then we also wanted to stabilize the property tax system. And we wanted to have greater predictability for both government and taxpayers. So 5 years in the books, and that's exactly what we have. Taxing entities can no longer ride valuation waves to major tax increases. Rather, they would have to adjust their tax rate to do so, and we find that that's rarely the case. So this slide here shows you the roller coaster effect that we had during the real estate boom. And that's something that we wanted to eliminate. We wanted smoother growth rates. So what I'd like to do on this slide is just compare the similar trends to see how efficient 117 has been in the last 5 years. And we can do that by looking at the years 2000 to 2005. During that time, we saw full cash value and LPV grow at 52%. That was significant growth. And you see, because of the 2-part calculation, the LPV was closely tracking the full cash value during that time. Jump over the noise in the real estate boom and the ultimate collapse in the real estate market, and we see over the last 5 years, full cash value has grown by 44%. But now this time we have LPV growing at just 28%. So a significant difference there now with 117. If we didn't have 117 at this point, you'd see the same trend that you did between 2000 and 2005, but that is definitely not the case. So we see significant improvement with 117. If If you want to look at where the full cash value growth is occurring over the last 5 years, this shows you the different classes of property that we have. 9 classes of property. It shows you the difference between the full cash value we had in 15 and 2020. So looking at this chart, you can see obviously owner-occupied residential makes up the majority of the statewide tax base at $386 billion out of the $875 billion that we have. And they have 43% growth over that 5-year period. So that's obviously what's driving the total amount of 45%. We also have significant growth in class 4 residential rental. That's climbed as well, 63.5% over the last 5 years. And of course, class 1 commercial property, $165 billion, growing at 42%. So this slide shows you how the change in values are translated into the amount of taxes levied. Again, looking at the period between 2000 and 2005, we see significant levy growth. Both primary and secondary grew at about the same rate at 38.5%. Jumping over the noise again, looking at the last 5 years, we see huge improvement there. Total levies have grown 21% or 4.3% per year on average. Now, the majority of taxes levied are for primary taxes, which fund the M&O of local government budgets. Those climbed 15% over the last 5 years. So huge improvement there on the primary side. Secondary taxes, on the other hand, still maintain their growth as they did in the past at 36% growth. And of course, your secondary levies fund voter-approved bonds and overrides. So there are some local governments that think they're dying on the vine with 117. We don't think that's the case. We just think there's more reasonable growth now. So this is just a recap of everything I've already talked about. I won't go through all the details again, but looking, if you take anything away from the slide, look at the LNAV growth column. Again, between 2000 and 2005, the LPV grew at 10.6% per year. Now with 117 over the last 5 years, we have 5.5% growth. So significant improvement there. Total taxes levied have went from 7.7% on average per year. Now we're down to 4.3%. So significant improvement with 117. So the statewide average property tax rate is the relationship between the statewide net assessed values and levies. When you see significant swings in net assessed values and levies, you have significant movement in your statewide average tax rate. And we see that being the case prior to 117. Again, looking at between 2000 and 2005, the statewide average tax rate, you started having growth in the real estate market. That statewide average tax rate dropped to $1.12. You get into the real estate boom, that rate drops even more significantly by 2.36 between 05 and 09, $2.36, only to jump back up again, $3.57 between 2009 and 2013. That line there for 117, that shows you what we have looked like over the last 5 years, and you can see that smoothing effect that we have. Statewide average tax rate has only dropped 60 cents. I just want to note here that the opposition at the time that we were advocating for 117 at the ballot said that 117 would put upward pressure on tax rates, and that is clearly not the case. So another feature that has added to the stability in our system, in addition to 117, are the truth in taxation laws. Now, truth in taxation requires a local jurisdiction, state and local, that if they want to increase taxes, they have to publish notice in the local newspaper, and they have to hold a public hearing to vote on the tax increase. In 1998 is when the first T&T laws were implemented. They applied just to local governments at the time, so counties, community colleges, and cities. And at that time, they only applied to the primary levies. A year later, the legislature extended that to the state rates, the qualifying tax rate and the state equalization tax rate. The legislature sets those rates. For that, those rates provide funding for K-12 schools. Well, every year that the state has adopted those rates, they've adopted T&T. So it's clearly most effective at the state level. In 2015, the legislature extended the T&T to also apply to countywide secondary taxing levies for libraries, flood control, jails, and public health services. So the positive impact that TNT has had on the statewide average tax rate is very clear. Over the last year, the statewide average tax rate dropped 24 cents. We see most of that on the primary side. Again, because the state adopts the rates for schools, K-12 schools, the QTR, and they adopted the TNT. We see a 9-cent reduction on the primary for K-12 schools. And by the way, you can see that K-12 schools make up about half of the total statewide average tax rate. There's some improvement also on the primary side with the locals, like the counties, the cities and towns. You see that there's no movement there at all, but community colleges have also adopted their TNT rates. On the secondary side, less improvement there, of course, because you have your voter approved bonds and overrides. That rate dropped only 7 cents this last year. I want to point out here that the counties, the secondary rate for the counties dropped 3 cents. And that's because we had several counties this last year adopt their TNT rates for their countywide special taxing districts. And we really appreciate that. But otherwise, we see that there's more to be done with TNT, less transparent at the local level. So we will pursue legislation next session to try to improve transparency at that level. So it wouldn't be an ATRA presentation without a slide on the effective tax rates. This is how our property tax system shifts taxes among the different classes of property. So again, we have 9 classes of property with varying assessment ratios. You can see class 3, class 4, 10% assessment ratios versus class 1, 18%. This creates a lot of inequity within our system. This chart shows you that the residential rental, although they carry that class carries about 50% of the tax base, they pay just 39% of the total taxes levied. You compare that to class 1, carrying 21% of the total value, pays about the same amount as homeowners at 35%. So in this slide, it also shows you the effective tax rates for class 1. It's 1.85%, a lot higher than you have for residential at 0.6%. So there was legislation this last session. There's tax reform package that would have improved the inequity within the system. We supported that measure. However, because of the brief session, it failed to go anywhere. So we are looking, that will be one of our top priorities next legislative session, because we believe that is an issue that definitely needs to be addressed. And this is my last slide. Prop 117, this ties everything in together, the improvements that we've made to our system because of Prop 117, as well as the TNT laws. This is the mailer that we use with 117. As complicated as our property tax system is, we tried to find a way that how do you get to voters quickly to have them understand what this measure does and how they'll be protected by it. So this was our roller coaster effect that we talked about. And again, we can see significant improvement in our system since 117 has been in place. So with that, I will hand it off to Sean to talk about K-12 levies.
Thanks, Jennifer. So today we're going to talk about a more narrow portion of property taxes in the area of K-12 secondary levies and some notes about capital spending on K-12 in Arizona. So secondary taxes are a key contributor to a K-12 system that at times leaves a lot to be desired. You know, Arizona's K-12 system was designed to make it so that students are essentially worth about the same no matter what school district they're in, and that taxpayers would pay roughly the same amount no matter where they live. However, there's some key features to the system that really disrupt that equity from both the taxpayer angle as well as the K-12 spending angle. And of course, some of the things that have always been true are still true today, that areas with higher value have higher spending and lower taxes, and vice versa. It's important to note that the state is currently being sued by K-12 districts over capital spending. The state is almost always being sued by the K-12 school districts, and this is a feature not only in Arizona, but nationwide. Of course, many will remember the capital lawsuit from the 1990s, Roosevelt v. Bishop, and that created some important changes to our system that we'll review. But a considerable part of the case is about equity and access to funds and taxpayer effort. And bonds and overrides are a key feature of that. And as long as we have this system as it is, the state will maintain this liability. These lawsuits are problematic for state policymakers because when you lose your opportunity to fix the system and judges take over. And so we're always telling lawmakers that you need to do what you can to reduce legal vulnerabilities as you go forward and try to make the system more fair for everyone. In the last several years, we've seen significant growth in K-12 bond approvals. We had historic approvals in years 2015, 2016, and 2019, where more than $1 billion were approved in access to bonding in those years. This amounts will change depending on how many districts are going out for bonds in that particular year. And so it's not always the same. And the decrease in 2020 was because there weren't that many districts going out for bonds this year. But as you can see, the vast majority of this activity is in Maricopa County. And this increase in activity has led to an increase in growth in K-12 secondary levies statewide. We've seen 18% growth in the last 3 years, just in bonds and overrides. And the reason for that is for large bond approvals, particularly in your larger school districts in Maricopa County. We've also seen a considerable increase in M&O overrides and the cost of those, largely because of the legislative 20 by 2020 program, which significantly increased the base spending for K-12 in Arizona. And of course, when voters pass an M&O override, that's on a percentage of budget. So if you pass a 15% override, it's on whatever your base budget is. And so if the legislature increases base budget, taxes are going to go up as well. We've seen 24% growth in just the last couple of years because of this feature in our system. Now, a little bit of that growth is because a handful of districts went for a larger override. Maybe they went from 10% to 15%, but that's a small feature. You can see this in per pupil amounts if you take the amount and then you divide it by the number of pupils in that district. So bond payments, as you can see, went up considerably, being worth about $825 a kid now. Considerable growth there, as well as in M&O overrides. And so you take in combination of those two, secondary levies are worth a considerable amount for those who have access to them. This is the median amount for those who have them. DA overrides are not on a percentage of budget, so the growth there has been smaller. Now, this is a narrow look at just bond expenditures. So this is not approvals. This is not access to debt. This is how much is being spent out of the bond fund in each year. And if you're having trouble seeing this, you can always move my image on your screen to get better access to that image. But you can see that this historically was growing through the 90s. And then the big change was in Student First. And so what drives access to GO debt historically has always been access to the debt, just the ability to access it, and then of course voter approval. And so what we saw in Students First was that the state said, all right, in response to Roosevelt v. Bishop, the 1990s capital lawsuit, we are going to spend more at the state level and we're going to reduce access to bonding at the local level. And so the constitutional limit was essentially, limited further statutorily, and districts had only access to 1/3 of their constitutional level. And so, of course, that access to bond spending decreased, and then therefore the expenditures decreased. However, this phenomenon changed in 2006 with the massive increase in property values. And Jennifer talked to you about how that massive growth. Now, access to bond debt is always on the full cash value. And so as we saw property values double, access to the bond debt could significantly increase. And of course, students had been growing all throughout this time. So this had very little to do with student growth, because all through this period, student growth was increasing at Arizona school districts. Now, of course, after 2008, you had the recession, property values went down, student counts stopped growing in Arizona, and then a lot of school districts who went out for bonds, those failed. A lot of those failed during the recession. So considerable change following the recession. But it is worth noting, if you look at that 2009 spending, that was the largest expenditure in state history out of the bond fund. And that, of course, occurred in the essentially the first year of the recession. And so when you wonder why K-12 advocates always go back to fiscal 2009 as their high watermark for spending, this is a big part of that. Not only were we getting federal monies to help sustain the budget in that year, but bond expenditures were incredibly high that year, and then they fell off a cliff, again, largely because of the recession and because voters were not approving them as high. And so if you adjust that $1 billion spending in 2009 for population and inflation going forward, it would have been impossible for the state to essentially fund that feature, which was largely a local funding measure. So you can see that now in fiscal 2019, we're back to record spending out of the bond fund, and we think that's going to continue to grow because of all of the recent approvals. Now, I know this slide is messy, but bear with me, and I will walk you through it. So the black line up top there is total capital spending in K-12 by year. And that is driven by a combination of local spending and state spending. So the local spending is in blue. That's what we just showed you on this slide. So this becomes the blue, and then the green and the yellow are a combination of state spending, formula spending, and then the yellow is school facilities board appropriations and authorizations in those particular years. And so there's been several factors that influence capital expenditures. Obviously, Students First caused that reduction in general obligation bond spending, but there was a significant increase in state spending, largely a result of new school construction. We were growing. You had the major programs, the deficiencies corrections programs that brought all school districts up to a baseline spending. There was over $1 billion spent on deficiencies corrections alone. And then there was a building renewal formula that lasted for a few years before policymakers during the Napolitano administration decided that that was a feature that was not very effective. And so you'll see that as School Facilities Board spending went down by 2004, but it still maintained quite a bit of spending all the way through 2008, largely on new school construction. So the state was spending a lot after Students First in total, while the bonding amounts went down. Of course, the housing boom propped up bond spending, and then the crash made it go back down. And you can see that SFB spending largely went down for many years because there was a lack of growth in schools post-recession, and is now coming back up as the state has started to spend more on the building renewal grant formula, building renewal grants to help maintain the minimum adequacy guidelines. So all this is to show that capital spending has been the result of a lot of different things, but not necessarily as a result of enrollment growth in schools, but more to do with access to debt and the state's spending on different programs. But is not necessarily a feature of state spending going down and local spending going up at the same time. You'll have to forgive the train. We're downtown, of course, so we get all of the nice features of being on 19th Avenue. So how do we achieve equity in spending? Well, you have to equalize spending, and you have to have less reliance on property values, things that we've known for decades, right? As a percentage, you have to spend more at the state level versus local spending. The difficulty is that a lot of advocates want both. They want increased spending at the state and increased spending at the local level as well, which can be difficult to achieve equity. All right, let's take a look at where do bonds and overrides go. Well, this is dominantly a feature of Maricopa County. 65% of district enrollment is in Maricopa County, and yet they have 80% of the bond dollars, 85% of M&O override dollars, and 92% of DA override monies. The vast majority, 99% of Maricopa County district students are in a district that has access to bond debt service as well as an override. And just because you have debt service doesn't mean you still have money in the bond fund. A district may have expended all of that money, but it does mean at some point their voters have approved access to bond debt, which is a considerably strong feature to be able to pass bonds, because that means you get access to money for capital that you can get regardless of what's happening within your district. Now there's 25 districts in the state that have all three, meaning bond and both overrides, and 23 of those are within Maricopa County, and that's a considerable advantage. The median total value for those with it in Maricopa County is about $2,000 per kid. Now, a lot of folks will talk about this against the backdrop of the charter formula gap. And for those of you who aren't aware, the baseline funding formula coming from the state allots a certain amount per student for district, and then a slightly different formula for charters. And the charter amount is higher, and policymakers made that choice largely because of access to bonds and overrides, as well as transportation formulas, other formulas in the system that charters don't have access to. Well, in Maricopa County, 89% of students are in a district where their bonds and overrides amount alone exceeds that charter gap. Now, outside of Maricopa County, it's a completely different picture. Just 30 districts have both an override and a bond. That's about 30% of their students. The median total value for those with one is only about $1,000 per student. And the value of bonds and overrides only exceeds that charter formula gap for 27% of students. And this doesn't take into account very tiny rural districts that have small school adjustment, but that's a small cohort. So this is a significant source of revenue and equities in the system. So we all know that a property value per pupil is a good way to measure that impact. And so you can split the state sort of in half and look at below median value per pupil, their amounts for bonds and overrides equates to about $1,000 per kid, and as cost their taxpayers a median rate of $2.08. Now, for those who have above median value, it's $1,800 per pupil, and it's less than $1 for the median tax rate. Now, in Maricopa only, these differences become even more dramatic, and it's useful to look at Maricopa because, again, that's where the vast majority of the monies are. But for those that have below median value per pupil, and again, that's just totaling up the property value in that district divided by the pupils, they have about $1,700 per kid at a pretty expensive rate of $3 or $2.90 per 100 on the tax rate. Whereas those who have those districts with above median value per pupil, it's worth about $2,700 per pupil and a rate that's about half of those with below median value. So very considerable differences. So let's put this to life. Let's look at some real life examples. This is a statewide look at the top 10 per pupil amounts for bonds and overrides. As you can see, Riverside Elementary, it's a Phoenix area district that's relatively small, but has a lot of property value. So their debt service per pupil is off the charts. Similar story in Sedona Oak Creek. But the vast majority of these districts in the top 10 are smaller districts that have considerable property value, so they can outspend peers on capital by considerable amounts, because again, the limitation has to do with access to debt, not having anything to do with students. There's also some Phoenix-based districts like Madison, Osborne, and Phoenix Union, and Tolleson Union, whose voters essentially will approve anything that is put before them, so they're able to outspend peers considerably. Now, if you look at the most expensive tax rates, this is a totally different story. These are districts that typically have a healthy number of students, but their property value is lower, and so their bonds and overrides tax rate are, I would say, prohibitively expensive. And so the majority of districts in this chart, you're seeing like Levine and Queen Creek, Vale, Higley, Sarita. A lot of these districts are bedroom communities that have a lot of students, but not necessarily a lot of property value because it's predominantly residential. And as Jennifer explained, we tax residential less than we do commercial industrial. So if the kids show up before commercial and industry shows up, you've got a real challenge here, because if you're in Levine Elementary where the new Loop 202 cuts through, you're going to have a really difficult time trying to attract people to your area with some of the highest tax rates in the state. The tax rates in Levine, Alhambra, Cartwright, and Pendergrass and Glendale Elementary, most of those are west side of Phoenix school districts. Their tax rates are so prohibitive that the economic development outlook in those areas is very bleak, because if you are a commercial or industrial taxpayer who's going to have a large exposure, you do not want to be inside these districts. And if you look at their total tax rates, they're much higher than other parts of the valley. So here's a look at Maricopa County, where I live here in the center part in Madison Elementary. Our bonds and overrides are worth $4,300 a kid at a pretty reasonable cost of $2 per 100. If you go down to Levine and South Phoenix, bonds and overrides worth about half that for a rate of $550. And you can look all through the west side of town there, and their bonds and overrides, are worth something, but not as much as you can find in areas with higher property values at considerably higher tax rates. So you can really start to see the inequities for both the schools as well as the taxpayers within these districts. And this is going to be a key feature in any equity lawsuit going forward to show the impacts of having voter approved activity. And so as that voter approved activity grows, you're going to make this problem worse as it becomes a larger feature of your overall K-12 finance system. And so what we would ask lawmakers is, every time you're thinking about K-12 spending and K-12 funding, you want to think about this problem and think about whether or not you're increasing the equity challenge or you're doing something to improve it and make our system more fair for everyone involved. Now, one thing that came up last session that wasn't completed due to the short session was School Facilities Board reform. As the chair, I have a personal interest in that. ATRA has a long interest in SFB. SFB was one of the key vehicles to providing equity in K-12 capital spending. And so it is a really, really important agency that the state has to constantly look at to get right. Now, the thrust of this agency has changed dramatically over time. At the beginning of Students First in the early 2000s, predominantly what it was doing was deficiencies corrections and building schools for a rapidly growing district community and school district community in Arizona. Well, that's not the case anymore. We're not really building a lot of new schools in Arizona. For the most part, what the program is doing is managing grants to keep schools out of what's called the minimum adequacy guidelines. That is court ordered that all school districts have to, from a capital physical infrastructure standpoint, be at those adequacy guidelines. And it's expensive and it's pretty difficult to spend $100+ million a year, $1,000 at a time replacing boiler heaters. And so the agency probably ought to be right-sized to manage what it is doing today. And so the goals should be a more efficient grant program, less bureaucracy for small projects. The oversight board should be modernized to fit its current role. And the legislature should be involved more and should be paying attention to how the money is spent. And so we concur with the idea to move it to ADOA, who has the professionalism and the experience in managing grant programs, and then it makes sense to use that capacity that they have there. And we think that the appropriation authority can simply live within ADOA for the Building Renewal Grant Fund in order to make it more efficient. And so we'll be heavily involved in that this year at the legislature. It's something that we think that we can get done, and we're working with a lot of stakeholders on that right now. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Kevin, who is going to do a Prop 108 postmortem.
Good morning. When we were putting together the program a couple of months ago, we were hoping that our staff presentation would include a look back on how lucky we were that we dodged the bullet with the passage of Prop 208 and all the damaging economic consequences associated with that. As you all know, that didn't happen. And so we stand here today now looking at a measure that passed that puts us at number 9 in the country with the highest income tax rate in the country. And we talked a lot about the campaign, about the damages associated with that, which we really are the case. The postmortem on 208 has already started. And one of those is a discussion about why this could have happened in the state of Arizona. Why did it pass here? So I want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about that, because I think that it's deeper than what at least I have heard today. The narrative so far goes that we had a dramatic increase in the number of voters in Arizona. Those voters are transplants from dominantly left-leaning states like California, Illinois. And those voters, when they came here, brought with them their voting proclivities and liberal voting trends, and voted and accepted the class warfare argument that was peddled by the teachers union and tens of millions in out-of-state funding. Clearly, there is some of that, I think, that went into the passage of 208. But I think when you look at what happened across the United States and the failure of similar class warfare measures that were on the ballot, the state of California had a very, very damaging proposal to create a split roll in the property tax system. That split roll, by the way, sort of mirrors what we do, shifting taxes from residential taxpayers to business, and would have done significant economic damage, in my opinion, to California. States of Illinois and Colorado had measures similar to 208, where they were creating more progressivity, opportunities for more progressivity in the income tax. A lot of that grounded in the class warfare approach that Prop 208 engaged in. So I think it's important to ask, if those proposals failed in those states, why in the world would a similar proposal passed in Arizona? So it can't possibly just be that left-leaning voters came to Arizona and swung it for 208. And I think there are two things that should be added to the consideration of why it passed and thought about on an ongoing basis going forward as to what happened here. The first, I think, has to do with the voters' perception of school funding in Arizona. I'm in my 35th year at ATRA. I've been at the Capitol for a long time, I can tell you from the first day I stepped foot on the Capitol, I was exposed to the argument that Arizona ranked low in school funding, and therefore the lawmakers were being encouraged to spend ever increasing amounts of money to fund them based solely on that isolated statistic that we ranked low in school funding. For years, that had limited effect on policymakers who, to their credit, took time to understand what that statistic meant, how we might have arrived at that ranking, and what they could possibly even do about that ranking if they were to pump a lot of significant revenue into the system. That all changed, as I think many of you have seen in recent years, where that statistic, our low per pupil ranking, is literally baked into the political fabric of Arizona. It isn't just a statistic that is peddled by the teachers union and the school boards association. It's a statistics that is used by business organizations as reasons to increase funding, as opposed to funding that's being increased to solve a particular problem. It's no longer a partisan issue where you just see one party peddling that statistic and the other party either ignoring it or trying to ask what it really means. It's now bipartisan. And so that statistic, I think, has and will continue to have a significant impact on future tax questions in this area. I'll give you an example of, I think, the extent to which the statistic sort of covers all sins in the conversation. One well-known, much read editorial writer at the Arizona Republic, I was glad to see early on in the conversation, had an editorial that was quite critical of Prop 208, a editorial that she said was most unfair, that all taxpayers should participate in the funding of our school system, not just a select few of high earners that make up less than 2% of the property tax filers. But shortly before the election, out came another editorial from her where she rationalized that, notwithstanding what she had said before about how bad of a proposal Prop 208 was and how unfair it was, it had to be passed because there had to be a solution to the profound underfunding that has been chronically the case in Arizona. And so that, if that is going to be the rationale for any and all decisions in Arizona as it relates to public finance generally or school finance specifically, we've got a lot of problems going forward. As we have tried to educate policymakers in particular, there's not enough money in the Arizona economy for us to meaningfully impact that statistic. That statistic is going to be with us for years, and just like it's with all the other fast-growing states that have student growth that far exceeds other states. The second thing that I think impacted the passage of it and provided quite a soft beach for those that wanted to push something like Prop 208 is the notion that Arizona is a low tax state. As we developed, or we debated the proponents of 208 all over Arizona and with the media, they didn't miss an effort to suggest that Arizona is a low tax state. In fact, most incorrectly said the Arizona legislature has cut taxes every year for the past 20 years. If you look to that's can't even possibly be the case after going through the Great Recession. But while that's not true, you do have to try to come to terms with what the newcomers moving to Arizona see when they start to begin to understand our tax system. Most of you, no doubt, have met somebody that moved here from another state and is interested in public finance or taxation, school spending, what their school gets, and they quickly note to you that they're paying half the property taxes that they did in the state that they moved from. I've had that experience many, many times. We would be naive to not acknowledge that goes on a regular basis, and it serves to inform them about.
Apologize for that. We were doing so well. We thought didn't
anticipate the internet would go down in the ATRA offices. I'm gonna just try to maybe reboot a little bit. So the second issue of the property taxes that newcomers to the state experience is a function of the classification system that Jennifer showed in the last slide of her presentation, where we by design make sure that homeowners don't feel the full costs of school spending. School spending makes up the majority of the property tax bills that go out across the United States. And so most people are moving and intuitively know that that's where a lot of their property tax bills go. So we not only go to great lengths to delude them into thinking that their tax bill isn't what it should be. We double down on the classification system with a homeowner rebate that now exceeds 420 million annually that the legislature uses to pay down school taxes. So the collision of the public's perception of a ranking that is not well understood and analyzed with a property tax system that greets newcomers with something that tells them that the schools must be underfunded because their property tax bill is lower than otherwise should have been is a significant issue going forward. So as we debate the postmortem on 208 and why all of this happened, we need to be cognizant that this isn't going to end at the end of the debate on a week later after 208 had passed. I got an email from Save Our Schools that championing the victory of 208 said we're not done. We need another $3.5 billion to get to the national average. So all of us should acknowledge that we're going to see more of this. Lawmakers certainly, and the governor, I think, understand that notwithstanding putting $4 billion in new money into the schools in the last 5 years certainly didn't whet their appetite and didn't stop them from leaning on this statistic that we rank low. So as we debate this and move forward on it, I think we need to be cognizant that Arizona had asked for a little bit of this in terms of how they shape voter attitudes towards school spending. And so with that, I'm going to conclude, and we are going to move to the next segment of this, where we're going to hear from somebody at the national level and shift from Arizona to Washington. And we are grateful to have with us today a gentleman that I've known for several years who does great work on behalf of the Tax Foundation, that's an ally of the Arizona Tax Research Association, to talk about some state tax issues from a national perspective, the recent elections, and the impacts associated with that. Jared Walczyk is the Vice President of State Projects with the Center for State Policy at the Tax Foundation. He's the lead researcher on the annual State Business Climate Index and Location Matters, and previously authored and co-authored tax reform books in Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. His work has been cited by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Politico, and many other prominent national and state outlets. He is a graduate of the Grove City College in Pennsylvania, where he got a degree in political science. He's joining us today to provide updates on major tax issues in states around the nation, an explanation of the implications resulting from the 2020 election. So with that, welcome, Jared. You're on.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Kevin. It's good to be with all of you today. Taxation is often considered a bit of a pain in the neck. I am dealing with one of my own right now. I'm dealing with some neck issues, so bear with me. I'm going to do my best, but it seemed to have a pinched nerve that I got this morning, so hopefully I'm going to get through all of this. But it is good to be with you, if only remotely. I wish we were in person. I've been wishing a lot of these events were in person. But there's obviously a lot going on in the tax world, and a lot of that has to do with the election. And obviously, Arizona has been sort of at the forefront of what a lot of people have been looking at in the elections, both in the, well, three things: the presidential election, the legislature that many thought would flip and did not, and also, of course, the tax measures on the ballot, which have already been discussed. But these things, I think, have all been really significant. You know, you've seen the focus on your state nationally, but I want to take you to look a little at the rest of the country and what the prospects are for additional federal relief, what taxes might look like in the future, and how that can affect states both in their revenue needs and also in conformity issues, especially since Arizona has taken significant strides in recent years to conform more on federal taxes. So first, let's talk a little about post-election, what the prospects are and what the potential scope is for additional federal aid to states, because I think that's been on everyone's mind. The CARES Act obviously provided aid in two ways to states. Obviously, it provided a lot of aid directly to individuals and to businesses, but it helped states out in two ways. One was with some sort of financial assistance, and that came in the form of some flexible aid, some additional Medicaid assistance that can be flexed in a variety of ways, and it also came in the form of some restricted aid, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that $150 billion that everyone sort of remembers. The other way that's often overlooked, though, that state budgets were substantially helped by the CARES Act is the degree to which it propped up the economy as a whole, and therefore propped up a lot of the means by which states raise revenue. Obviously, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, kept employment up, kept paychecks flowing, and because of that also kept some consumption going that really propped up state income taxes and to some degree state sales tax collections. The unemployment compensation program set up by the federal government, the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and then the subsequent $300 a week assistance, that's been really meaningful for state revenues because that's taxable. This is in fact taxable income, and for many individuals who have unfortunately lost their jobs, the revenue is actually quite similar to what it had been previously, the income that they're earning, and therefore the tax revenues coming out of that fairly similar. So a lot of the early projections about just how deep the economic impact is going to be on the states have not really panned out. You've seen that in Arizona. We've seen that across the country. We've seen the end of fiscal year 2020, and we've actually seen the revenue now for that entire year, and it's down. State tax collections are down about 5.5% for that year, which sounds not great, not terrible perhaps, but it's actually better than that because you'll recall that practically every state delayed income tax filing and payment obligations into the next fiscal year, into July. And if you account for that shift, you're basically at a flat line, where fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 had roughly identical tax collections. Now, 2021, the year we're in now, fiscal year, is definitely going to be down in most states because that's when the bigger hit is coming on income taxes. The good news is sales taxes have recovered. You had that awful late March, early April, early May, when stay-at-home orders were in place throughout the country in many places. But since then, they have recovered. They are really on the same line that we anticipated prior to the pandemic. So we lost a couple months. We've recovered since. That's good news. But there are a variety of losses that states are going to experience during this year. The really good news in Arizona is that the projections have changed. I'm sure many of you have seen the new October projections. You probably know them far better than I do. But there's been a change from projected shortfalls to projected surpluses. Now, that doesn't mean that tax collections are up. They are not. It means that between better than expected tax collections, some lower than expected expenditures, the reserves that the state had, and the federal assistance that's been received, there's now actually a surplus. That doesn't mean you're out of the woods, but it's obviously a much better place to be than you or probably most states thought they would be a few months ago. And this has been the story across the country, where revenues have just held much steadier than anticipated. Tax revenues look to be down more between like 7 and 10% for this fiscal year, as opposed to projections of 15 to 20%. And in subsequent fiscal years, it looks like the recovery will be much faster. You look even back to, say, July, when the Congressional Budget Office was putting together a baseline for unemployment, and they assumed that we would end this year with over 10% unemployment. You probably are aware that as of October, it was 6.9%. We're just way ahead of that curve. We were supposed to hit 6.9% at the end of calendar year 2022. We're 2 years ahead of that recovery. Now, there's no guarantees in life, and there are some issues that are cause for concern. PPP expires. the the additional pandemic unemployment assistance expires. And if those things are allowed to expire, then there's going to be a deeper hit to state revenues than we've seen thus far. If if this second round of lockdowns that we're seeing in some states expand and more businesses close, it may be tougher to get through the second one, even with federal assistance, than the first. So there are no guarantees in any of this. But as we look at it right now, the situation looks significantly less dire than it did a little while ago. So good news in that area. And that, of course, impacts the decisions that Congress needs to make about what a federal relief package would look like. Initially back in May, you had congressional Democrats pushing the HEROES Act, which had $1.1 trillion in state and local aid. Especially now that we are presumably going to have a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. Obviously, that's contingent on what happens in Georgia, and I have no crystal ball. But if that were to be the case, I don't think that we would expect anything on the measure of 1.1 trillion. I think that we'd be looking at something significantly smaller that is more attuned to the sort of numbers we are seeing right now economically. So a couple $100 billion. But I do think that will come. I think it'll be more flexible aid than we saw previously. Instead of being tied to direct responses to the pandemic, it'll allow budget gaps to be backfilled. And I suspect that the formulas will change, and I think they should change. Both sides were looking at formulas previously that were significantly about where there were COVID cases. There are COVID cases everywhere, and that's not really a good measure of how bad a state's economy is hurting. And a lot of the early numbers were really designed around making sure that you could help New York and California, which were hit incredibly hard, and you had to give almost too much money to everyone else to make them close to whole. I think what you'll ultimately see is formulas that are based more on unemployment levels than they are on anything else, which means you probably get less than some states, but the overall package is itself also somewhat smaller. I think those are coming. I don't think they're coming in the lame duck, but I think that they are coming early in the new year, and we'll have to see what that looks like. On the federal tax standpoint, if we have divided government, I don't expect massive changes on taxation, certainly in the first year, and maybe not in the first Congress of a Biden presidency. I think that'd be more likely if Democrats had the had Congress in the second part of it, which I don't know if that's likely, but that would be when you would see significant changes. If Democrats had unified control, obviously Biden had a tax plan that included substantial alterations of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That now seems like anything that's going to happen is more modest. There might be some room to maneuver, though, because Republicans have some reason to negotiate since significant portions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire. And there's some leverage there to allow certain provisions that Republicans care about to be made permanent, certain things that Democrats care about to be reversed or gone in a different direction. So you could maybe see some things, but there's a lot of tensions here. There's talk about, say, eliminating the SALT deduction cap. So if you do something like what Biden has in mind, 39.6% top rate, get rid of, bring back the PEAS limitation, cap all deductions at 28%, and then uncap SALT, that's a wash. Like, there's actually no real additional revenue that's raised there. It just changes the relative balance who pays it in the states. So there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily terribly helpful, things that would be difficult to navigate. But there are a couple of things that are potentially notable for states. The biggest one in my mind is GILTI. This is that global intangible low taxed income piece that large multinational businesses care about. But basically, we used to have what was called a worldwide tax system at the federal level, where the United States taxed businesses on all of their income across the world, and then provided them credits based on the taxes they pay to other countries. It's basically how we do individual income taxes at the state level. We now have a quasi-territorial system. You only pay on your US income, but there are some adjustments. The GILTI is the big one, where it's a guardrail. It says, like, okay, if you're doing profit shifting, if you're doing things that we think are just tax workarounds rather than actually engaging in economic activity in other countries, then we're going to bring that back in. States are in many cases conforming to GILTI. Arizona, I think, has done the right thing here. Actually, we had some conversations with legislation in the governor's office. I know that ATRA did, like, on how to handle GILTI, but a lot of states brought it in, and some states may reverse themselves if they need revenue. I think that's going to be one place where states go looking for revenue, is this provision. And it's been a new thing. States generally haven't taxed much international income of businesses located in their states. Now they're doing a little of that. The Biden plan really changes GILTI. It goes to a country-specific allocation approach. It raises the rates on it. I won't go into all of the technical details unless that's something that people have questions on. But the reality is, it comes pretty close to being the old worldwide system, run through the guardrail regime. And the scary thing about that is states never brought the old worldwide system into their codes, but many states do bring the guardrail in, GILTI. And suddenly you can have states having basically worldwide taxation in their state tax codes. They're not built for it. The way that states are conforming to GILTI is a mess because it just can't bring in some of the provisions like dealing with federal tax credits, international tax credits, all of that. It's way too complex for state tax codes as currently devised. I think it could be a substantial issue. States need to hold the line against that and say, we are not bringing that in. But that's something very clearly to watch in the coming months and years if that would in fact change. States are doing a lot to respond to the revenue shortfalls. Obviously, Arizona, kind of uniquely among states, chose to raise taxes this past, at the ballot. And Kevin already talked a lot about why Arizona did that when you saw states like Illinois not do it, and you saw Colorado cut its income taxes. And I think it's exactly right to say this was about education more than it was about taxes. And he already gave you a good rundown of what the different arguments have been there and what the issues will be. But clearly, just as a generic statement, when you combine a proposed tax increase with a popular spending priority rather than just general government revenue, it's going to be more popular. And there is this perception that Arizona has historically been a lower tax state, but there's clearly an issue about positioning. That Arizona has been a state that has benefited profoundly from being an alternative to California and some other high tax regimes. And while you're still clearly a far better tax regime than California, which is getting worse constantly, that gap has been narrowed and it's not as competitive. And if you're the sort of person who's motivated to leave California over taxes, sure, Arizona's better, but there are other states that are better still. And I do worry a little about that competitive advantage shift because you've clearly been able to benefit both from the snowbirds and from the exodus from California, and that's probably a little less attractive now. But a lot of states are going to be looking for new revenue in a variety of ways. I think the experience of the Great Recession is that most states are going to avoid the really big tax increases, especially early on general taxes. You're not going to see a lot of income tax increases. You're not going to see a lot of sales tax increases. If even a state like Illinois says, no, let's not raise income taxes, it's not going to be hugely popular in most states, but you're going to see a lot of tinkering around the edges. You're going to see things like corporate tax credits being frozen or capped, even when they've already been earned. California's already done that. You're going to see changes to net operating loss regimes, changes to GILTI. I think you're going to see creativity in tax codes in ways that is potentially disturbing. A lot of states are looking already at things like, can they tax digital advertising or digital services? Can they tax wealth? A couple of states are looking at that. Can they go to mark-to-market taxation of capital gains income? These things, I think, are very dangerous. They are largely untested. They don't work arguably well at any level, but certainly not at the state level where it's so easy to shift income and activity to another state. But some of them are just functionally unadministratable. I mean, think about mark-to-market taxation. This is the idea that you pay capital gains on the unrealized income from investments. And okay, let's say that I own stock because, okay, I've got an investment portfolio. I see some gains. I haven't actually cashed out. I haven't had a transaction, but we know what those gains are. I can look at my portfolio and say, okay, I've seen this sort of appreciation. I now need to pay taxes on that, which may mean I have to liquidate some of my stocks to pay it if I don't have that elsewhere. But this is doable, right? I mean, this is a liquid market. I can do this. But that's me. What if instead you are a small business owner and your wealth is tied to your ownership stake in your LLC or your S corporation? And someone, the government somehow, or you have determined that it has appreciated in value, which is very hard to measure because I know what stocks are trading for. You don't know exactly how your business has appreciated in value. But let's say it's appreciated substantially in someone's mind. Well, how do you pay for this? This isn't a cash flow. There's not a flow, it's a stock. Do you have to liquidate some of the business to pay on this unrealized gain that you may never realize because there might be a reversal of fortunes? This is a mess, but states are looking at it. Federal government has been looking a little at that too. That's something that Senator Wyden, who may have a chairmanship if Democrats were to take the Senate, is very interested in and has pushed for a couple of years. But these things are, in my mind, very ill thought out. There's no real way to appraise and assess this value, and it's it's a backdoor wealth tax that I think is very detrimental to economic growth and especially to business, non-corporate business ownership. So we'll see a lot on those things. I mean, federal tax is definitely going to have a variety of impacts on the states in coming years, but probably the bigger impact really is going to be what the federal government does on relief. So everyone's watching that. Again, I think we're expecting some continuation of relief, especially if we do go into another period of, some additional shutdowns that you would probably see expansion of PPP again. I think that the additional $300 a week is probably not going away, but these things are all significant concerns because so much state revenue has been contingent on that. The experience we had of the Great Recession and of previous recessions is that it's pretty dangerous for states to substantially raise taxes during a recession while businesses are trying to recover. You need to make sure that there's an opportunity to get people back to work, that employment can rise first, that reinvestment where it's necessary can happen. And after the Great Recession, I think only 4 states raised a general tax rate in the following 3 years. Now, after that, you saw more, but in the interim, you were more likely to see things like raising the cigarette tax or miscellaneous taxation. Borrowing obviously was substantial. Unemployment insurance taxes are an area where every state is going to have to watch the way UI tax systems are built. I mean, they're basically their social insurance regime, or at least that's what they're designed to be. So businesses that have more of a history of layoffs, more seasonal, end up paying higher insurance premium rates, essentially in the form of higher taxes. They have what's called a bad experience rating, and that means they pay more. There are also solvency taxes and solvency levels in these UI tax regimes in Arizona and elsewhere in the country, where essentially when the system is depleted, the taxes rise. There can be a special solvency tax that applies to everyone, but also just on every rate schedule, the rates creep up. And this is a countercyclical tax. It basically hits you hardest when the economy is worst. And that's not how social insurance regimes or any insurance regime is supposed to work. You're supposed to pay in the good times and benefit from it in the bad times. And that works for the individuals, the employees. It doesn't work very well for the employers because most states, and Arizona is really no exception, like to keep rates pretty low during the good years because no one wants to tax when you don't feel like you need to tax. Likes to keep benefits fairly generous, and you kind of got to choose among those. And then they scramble to catch up when the things get bad. And of course, these trust funds are being depleted. States are going to the federal government for loans. These loans have to be paid back. If they're not paid back within 2 years, then the unemployment insurance rates that are levied by the federal government, which are negligible in good years, start rising dramatically on in-state payers. And the state ultimately has to pay these back. The reality is UI taxes are going up probably just about everywhere after this, but timing really matters because the most important thing right now is that a business is able to reemploy people they've laid off. The taxes may be necessary, but they can wait. It is far more expensive for state and federal government to keep paying UI benefits than it is to have UI taxes be a little lower for a little longer. So these are things that states are going to have to watch. They're going to have to get the timing right, but it is coming. Even the states that have had well-managed UI systems, they almost all raised tax rates after the Great Recession. Many of them raised UI tax rates temporarily after the 2001 recession. This is obviously a deep one. This is one with massive outlays and significant debt in Title 12 advances from the federal government in almost every state now. Or will be soon. I think there's 20 some states that have it already, and many more that are like on the cusp and will probably hit there by the end of the year. So clearly something to watch, but timing matters a great deal on these things because you don't want to step on the recovery. So I think there's a lot to watch. There's a lot of things to avoid. Arizona has, I think, done a lot of things right in recent years. You have lowered income taxes until now. You've simplified a very complex sales tax regime that looks a lot different than the ones that most other states have historically had. You have property taxes that are competitive. And it's important not to mess with what worked, even if we are obviously in difficult times. And federal aid will help with that. But I have urged policymakers in every state to realize that federal aid is not the end-all be-all, and we don't know when it's coming. I worry that a lot of legislators across the country have basically taken the position that the best choice is to do nothing, to just assume that the federal government will ride to the rescue, and therefore there's no reason to cut, there's no reason to think about alternatives, there's no reason to delay any expenditures. In fact, in some ways, running up the biggest deficits possible is good because it shows the federal government just how much you need. Thankfully, Arizona has not done that, and I think that shows in the most recent revenue outlook, but it is something to keep watching, because I don't know that the federal relief is going to be as much as some states had initially been counting on. Certainly if they were looking at the HEROES Act, it's not going to be the HEROES Act. There's a question of what it will be, but I think something in the hundreds of billions, not the trillions. And there's a question of how long it's supposed to last, because this isn't just about fiscal year 2021. I think that will be the deepest hit, obviously, but 2022, 2023, these are going to be below trend line years as well. And it's going to take some time to recover from all of this. So a lot to look forward to. In a somewhat negative sense, a lot of things to be focused on. But state revenue outlooks on the whole, again, like we're looking more like 7 to 10% losses for this fiscal year, probably 5% lower than previously expected for the following fiscal year. And then after that, recovering, I think, probably pretty close to past trend line. The states that are going to be exceptions. I mean, New York is looking at 64 billion in losses over 4 years. California is looking at over 50 billion in losses over a 3-year period. Thankfully, you are not there. Most states are not, and you are in a growing number of states that are actually showing surpluses. Again, doesn't mean revenue growth, but it means that you found ways to balance budgets, and I think that's a very good thing. And it's good to build in some buffer right now. There's a lot that we could talk about within any of this. I don't know, Sean or Kevin, if you wanted to do any questions, but I can leave it there since I think we may have shifted some times a little. And if you want to move on, we can move on. If not, I can answer questions.
Well, thanks so much for that, Jared. That was great. There's so much information packed into a short period of time. I think we're all probably still recovering from all that. Trying to sort it all in our minds. There's a lot to think about. One thing that you touched on, talking about the tax changes at the ballot in places like, in California and Illinois, they've rejected those 2 measures that were bad policy. Colorado, somewhat in surprise, cut taxes at the ballot. And obviously, it's really different when it's not paired up with a popular spending program, as you mentioned. But does that signal some kind of shift to you in those states as to what their citizens think about tax policy? Or what are you making of, particularly California and Illinois, with those rejections?
Yeah. So in some ways, I look at the 2020 tax ballot questions as being a very status quo election and a very non-status quo year. You could have seen the same outcomes in 2014. No pandemic, no Trump Biden, just like you could have seen this in any year, which I think is not what a lot of people expected. Some things constantly hold true. All things being equal, voters, doesn't matter if it's a red, blue, or purple state, they don't like tax increases, especially on general taxes. If they're given the option of lower or higher income taxes, they will default to lower income tax. Washington state voters, very progressive state, have routinely rejected imposing an individual income tax in a state that doesn't have one. Illinois voters have been very skeptical of a higher and graduated rate income tax in a state with a relatively low flat income tax. And of course, in a high tax environment where they don't want necessarily to raise anything else. And California voters have been very, very zealous in their defense of Prop 13, which is their property tax limitation regime. And I will tell you, it's a mess of a property tax limitation regime. It's really bad for their economy in many ways, but they're a high tax state, and it is one thing that is constraining the rate of growth of their taxes. I can look at it from a public finance perspective and say this is like the worst possible way to create something like that, but it is constraining the rate of revenue growth. And even when it's okay, let's raise it for businesses, I think a lot of voters said, we're not opening that door. You do that and we're next. So voters rejected a lot of tax increases in a lot of places, but that's sort of the default. They were willing to raise cigarette taxes. They were willing to legalize marijuana and impose taxes on that. And in many ways, Arizona is the outlier, but it's the outlier that makes sense. If you look over the last decade or so, income tax increases that have been accepted, I think there's been 14 or 15 that have been rejected over the last decade, and 7 that have been accepted. And 5 of the 7 were tied to either education or healthcare, in my recollection.
Thanks for that. My second question, I think this will be the last one before we wrap it up, is related to the SALT cap. I think that this is one of the more understated features of the system post TJICTA, and I think that we're still sort of seeing the impacts of that change. And we know that obviously higher end filers don't like it, but for states that have higher income taxes, Arizona now being one of them, have we started to see anything that you think would indicate changes in behavior as a result? Do you think that, you know, the combination of, you know, now being fully exposed to local taxes, now with the pandemic, the increase in work from home, it seems like kind of a perfect storm to change behavior associated with that SALT cap? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, some taxpayers do vote for the feet as this concept of T-boot competition, and it absolutely happens. It usually happens when there is a precipitating event. Basically, most of us are not willing to just pick up and move. It's a big, expensive thing to do. Your job is associated with a certain location, maybe your family's there. We don't usually do it just because taxes have risen a little, but it comes into play when we're already thinking about our options. So there have been studies before the SALT cap was imposed, the $10,000 cap, that said that that difference might be associated with about a 5% change in migration. And I think that's about what we saw. The migration moved a little, probably expanded a bit in places like New York, but not a huge hit on their revenues. However, we are now in one of those situations where the salience of tax differences, those differentials, really matters. If you are in a high tax state and suddenly you don't need to be there because your job can be done remotely, now all of a sudden you've already been gone for what, 8 months now? Why move back? And I think suddenly those differentials and just the general differentials between high and low tax states are way more significant to people. And if I'm a policymaker in a high tax state with a lot of urban cores that have historically had these agglomerations of industries, and you said like the tech industry has to be in San Francisco or one of the other 5 or 10 Silicon somethings, or the finance industry has to be in New York or something like that, I don't think it does anymore. And I think that suddenly tax will make way more difference than it had in the past.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Jared. Again, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for checking in with us today and giving us that national perspective. And we'll hope to see you again at an ATRA event in the future. Now I'm going to pass it back to Kevin, who will introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Jared.
Very good. Thanks again, Jared, for that. We're going to wrap up the morning portion of the program with switch gears slightly and get a little bit of a political perspective on the outcome of the 2020 elections, on politics and public finance in Arizona. Richard Bark this morning in introducing Richard Stabniak said he needed no introduction. Certainly that is the case with the gentleman we have chosen to do this. Bob Robb, as all of you know, has been a columnist at the Arizona Republic for many years, 1999 to be exact. He's a close observer of Arizona politics and public policy, though, for over 40 years. Prior to joining the Arizona Republic, Bob ran his own public affairs and public relations agency for 13 years. He frequently appears on local TV and radio with his insight on fiscal and political matters. In my opinion, if you follow politics and public policy in Arizona, Bob is required reading. In particular, his work on public finance and taxation issues is cutting edge, and he has played a key role in shaping many public policy changes in Arizona throughout his career. He's going to highlight the major takeaways and trends in Arizona politics following the 2020 election. Bob, thank you again today for joining us, and take it away. You're on.
Someone needs to unmute.
Am I live now?
Hey, Bob, we're still not hearing you. It just shows that you're unmuted, but we can't hear you for some reason.
What do you want me to do?
Can you try that again?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, sorry about that.
I think that was our fault, actually. We apologize.
Well, a lot of people have been trying to mute me over the course of my career. Thank you, Kevin, and it's always great to be with you and ATRA. Very much appreciate and have depended over many years for the very fine quality work that you and the whole crew at ATRA do, and appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts about the most recent election. And where I'd like to start is with a bit of a broader historical perspective The discussion of the extent to which Arizona has become purple or turning blue often begins with the assumption that Arizona has been solidly red for a very long time. And that's just not the case. The Republican monopoly on state politics is actually a relatively recent development. Republicans didn't outnumber Democrats in registration in the state until the mid-1980s. For the first 100 years of the state's history, there was always at least one Democrat who held a statewide elected office. It wasn't until 2013 that there were no Democrats in state government or representing the state in Congress or in the US Senate that wasn't elected in a statewide race. And if you go back to 2006, Democrats Janet Napolitano and Terry Goddard won their re-election races for governor and attorney general respectively by overwhelming margins. In 2008, there were 3 corporation commission seats up in Arizona, and Democrats won 2 of them. It was only from that point forward until the election of 2018 that Arizona Republicans swept all statewide races and overwhelmingly dominated the Arizona legislature. To me, the high point of Republican monopoly on state politics occurred in 2014. The suite of state offices from governor to superintendent of public instruction were up for election. The Democrats fielded what I described at the time as probably the most qualified slate of candidates for either party in all of Arizona history. And virtually all of the Democratic candidates, even though arguably far more qualified than their Republican opponent, lost, and virtually all of them by a huge margin, approximately 10 percentage points. The only exception was David Garcia's close call in the superintendent of public instruction race. So what occurred from that high point of Republican dominance of state politics, which was at that point in time a relatively recent development, to 2018 and 2020, where Democrats got back into the game. One of the most important things that happened is that during that period, Democrats did reduce the registration advantage that Republicans had enjoyed. In 2014, Republicans outnumbered Democrats in the state by approximately 180,000 registrants. By 2020, that had shrunk to approximately 130,000 registrants. And during that 6-year period, Arizona added 1 million voters. So obviously you had a smaller registration advantage over a much larger body politic. You also had, with Trump, a shrinking of the traditional Republican advantage in turnout. I haven't seen turnout numbers by party yet, but here and all over the country, I think there's an acceptance that Democrats turned out almost in the same percentage as Republicans. And so that put Democrats in the game. But I believe that the story of this election is the behavior of independents in Arizona. If you go back to 2016, where Trump carried the state by 3.5 percentage points, independents in Arizona, and this is true nationally as well, actually tilted slightly towards Trump. It was a pretty even split between he and Hillary Clinton, but a slight advantage to Trump. You go forward to 2020, and the independents in Arizona and nationally tilted strongly against Trump by a low 50s to low 30s margin, more than 10 percentage points. And I think that is pretty much the story of the Arizona election, with Democrats reducing the natural advantage that Republicans have in registration and turnout. The independents going decisively in one particular direction explains the outcome. It's the simplest explanation, and I don't think you need to go much further. You then had a curious development. Historically, when the independents, at least in Arizona, have gone strongly at the top of the ticket in one particular direction, that has tended to continue down ballot and hurt the party that's in the disfavor of independents down the ticket and down ballot races. That didn't happen as much as would be anticipated in this election. And I think looking at the county officers here in Maricopa County illustrates that the best. You had far more people voting in those races than you had for the presidential race. And Republicans won all of the county races except for sheriff. And there I think you've got a giant Arpaio asterisk that you had his deputy that was running to regain the seat. And so I think you continued to have the anti-Arpaio consensus. And Paul Pinzone had done a decent job, and he was a safe alternative. So if you take that out of the equation, Republicans won all those races. So the independents didn't go down ballot, either didn't participate in those races or voted for Republicans in sufficient numbers that Republicans were able to prevail. Now, they prevailed by less than the registration advantage would suggest that they should have prevailed. So there was still a slight tilt against the Republicans down ballot, but not enough that it couldn't be overcome. The conventional explanation for why Arizona is turning purple or bluish is on demography. You have all these people moving from out of state and bringing their previous state politics with them, or the rise of the Latino vote, that it's demographics. There's no doubt that there's some element of that, but I'm skeptical of it as an explanation for what has happened in Arizona. We simply are not demographically that much different than we were in 2014, where Republicans had a monopoly on state politics. We haven't changed that much in 6 years. And those trends were in effect even before the Republicans developed the monopoly beginning with the 2010 election. We had a lot of influx from people from out of state, and there hasn't been a huge change in the states from which we're getting in-migration. The Latino vote continued to increase during those years. And the exit polls don't really indicate that the Latino vote was a substantially larger share of the electorate in this election than it was even going back to 2012 when Romney defeated Obama in Arizona by a very decisive margin. I think the explanation is the independents. I think that we are now in a position where they hold the balance of power. And if they tilt one way or the other, That is going to decide the outcome of the election. And contrary to some other observers, I don't think the independents in Arizona are closet partisans. I believe that they are up for grabs. And I think you see that in comparing the 2016 presidential race in Arizona to the 2020 race, where in 2016, the independents modestly tilted towards Trump, and in 2020, they went decisively against him. In Maricopa County, independents actually outnumber Democrats. Now, that's undoubtedly true in registration and probably not so true in turnout. But I now think independents are enough of our electorate. Statewide, they're approximately a third of the electorate, and they vote in sufficient numbers. And the Republican advantage has been reduced to the point that I think the story of Arizona politics for at least the near future will be the independents own the balance of power. Now, in terms of what all this means for public policy in the state, I think we are going to be in another period with the COVID cloud that obfuscates where we are and are going to be in terms of revenues and expenses for a prolonged period of hunkered down status quoism. I wouldn't be surprised to see a skinny budget 2 adopted and the legislature call it quits early, at least until a vaccine is widely distributed. And particularly with voters having chosen such a close division between the parties in terms of the compensation of the legislature and the prospects for close elections, at least for the next few cycles. With that, let me open it up to questions and observations.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate your thoughts on the election. One question that comes to mind that I think a lot of people are talking about is, what do you think the passage of Prop 208 will have on future discussions and negotiations on school finance going forward?
I think we're going to see it in the next legislative session. Despite the cloud that COVID has cast over state revenues and expenses, and how tight the budget appears for the next fiscal year, I believe that without Proposition 208, there would have been a tremendous push in the legislature to run some risks to increase out of non-Prop 208 revenue expenditures for K-12 education. In the skinny budget 1, there were significant increases for K-12 education, even though the assumption at the time that the budget was adopted was that revenues would fall short and we would have to do something to ameliorate that shortage. With the passage of Proposition 208, with the surcharge going in effect in January, with the first distribution of monies occurring June 31 of next year, I think that pressure is relieved. And so I think that the argument that would have taken place over having a stretch budget that tries to do more than arguably is safe for K-12 education won't take place. And that's sort of a paradoxical result of the passage of Prop 208, but I think it relieves pressure to fund education from other sources. And given the uncertain financial circumstances that the state faces, I think that's likely to have a huge influence on budget discussions this next session.
Great, thanks for that. Senator Vince Leach asks, what does your crystal ball say about redistricting for the 22 election?
Well, I don't think who is on the Independent Redistricting Commission is as important as commonly stated, although certainly the Democrats last time used it to their advantage. But if you begin the process, as Arizona does, and I think will continue to do despite being relieved from the pre-clearance requirements under the Voting Rights Act, if you begin by creating majority-minority districts that are at least as numerous and at least as strong as the ones that currently exist, then your ability to district the rest of the state, I mean, you're talking about approximately a third of legislative districts and 2 or 3 of our congressional districts. What you can do with the rest of the state is highly limited, particularly given that we still sort of have population distribution that ends up being pretty closely aligned in terms of political outlook and ideology. The ability, you really have to kind of gerrymander after you have put the majority districts in place. You have to gerrymander to create competitive districts. And your ability to do that is relatively limited. Even if you look at the handiwork of the last redistricting commission, if you look at the legislature, the existing legislature has very few members who come from a party other than the party that has the plurality of registrants in the district. And you added a couple in this election, and in the Senate until this election, every single seat was held by someone from the party who came from the party that had the plurality of registrants. There's now only 1 of 30 senators who will come from a district where that person comes from the party that doesn't include the plurality of voters. So registration remains the main determinant of voting behavior. The distribution of it in Arizona makes it difficult once you start with majority-minority districts to do much about. So there'll be a lot of shouting and wailing and gnashing of teeth. But in the final analysis, I think our redistricting sort of falls into place on its own for the most part.
Great, thank you for that. Larry Lucero of Tucson wants to know have you seen any research on the demographics of Arizona independents and how they might be changing?
It is the studies that I have seen that try to get into answering the question of who are these independents in Arizona has, in my judgment, been sort of lacking. So the best insight I can gather is by watching voting behavior and the outcome of various elections. And as I described in terms of contrasting where the independent vote went in 2016 versus 2020, and if you go back to 2006, where the independents in Arizona went decisively for the Democrats, did the same thing in 2008, and then you had the Tea Party revolt, and independents went strongly for Republicans in 2010. I think they are, for the most part, up for grabs. Young people, in terms of a demographic profile, young people are overwhelmingly registering independent. The idea, I think, of our partisan political system just doesn't make much sense to them. And I also think you're seeing, if you roll back in time, we used to have a lot of split ticket voting, but it was Republicans voting for a Democrat rural Democrats, urban Republicans being willing to vote for a Democrat, rural Democrats being willing to vote for a Republican. I think we've had a sorting out of that, and there's now real party loyalty. There's not a lot of crossover voting. But the people who used to do that, I think to a very large extent, have re-registered independent. So I do believe that we will now have a deep dive by both parties, trying to understand the independent electorate at a far greater depth than I believe it is currently understood.
It's too late. Okay, we got one more from Representative Sierra. He wants to know if you believe it's time for everyone to accept the results of the Arizona and national presidential results.
Yes, I think that the questioning of the legitimacy of the vote count has been a great disservice, and I think will contribute further to the tarnishing of the Republican brand. I also want to say that we have a process by which election of results are deemed official. We have a certification process which is underway, will occur shortly here in Arizona. So I don't believe because media pundits with rooms full of nerds calculating models say that they call an election, that means that the election is over. And in Arizona, I think a particular disservice was done by calling Arizona before it was possible to know what the outcome in Arizona would be. But the vote counts are done. Certification processes are taking place. We have some of the fairest and most honest elections in all of human history. And the methodologies for ascertaining the accuracy of the vote count that were set up in advance have all been done, and no problems were found. And saying that we should change what we decided in advance was the way we were going to verify that just because your guy lost, I think does, while trying to create false impressions of serious problems with the vote, particularly here in Arizona and in Maricopa County, I think is a grave disservice, and I do believe will be additional tarnish on the Republican brand that will stick for a while.
Well, we really appreciate your comments today, Mr. Rob. Really thank you for taking the time to address ATRA Outlook. We always take a lot from your comments. There's certainly a lot to consider in a momentous year. And so we'll take this with us as we move forward. So thank you again. And we're going to move on to the final piece of our program. And I'm going to kick it back to Kevin. Thanks, Bob.
Very good. Thanks again. Thanks again, Bob, for that update. Always excellent. Before we close out the program with some remarks from Governor Ducey, I wanted to take the opportunity to again thank our sponsors. This is an important event for us annually. It wouldn't be a success without our sponsors. And certainly in this year, given the difficult circumstances, I really want to thank the people that stepped forward to sponsor this event today. Again, our copper sponsors were University of Phoenix, Arizona Public Service Company, Salt River Project, and Freeport-McMoRan. Our silver sponsors were Tucson Electric Power, Cox Communications, and Lumen. Our bronze sponsors were the Fenimore Law Firm, Intel, Lewis, Roca, Rothberger, and Christie, and the Arizona Cattle Feeders Association. Lastly, our premium sponsors were B3 Strategies, Arizona Policy Connect, the Kavanaugh Law Firm, Southwest Gas, and Veritas. We thank you very much for your support today. Last bit of I wanted to do before we announce the governor is also to thank the many elected officials that took time out of their busy schedule today to join us for the conference. On the Senate side, we have Senator Sonny Borelli, Senator Heather Carter, Senate President Karen Fann, Senator David Gowan, Senator Rick Gray, Senator Sean Kerr, Senator Vince Leach, Senator David Livingston, and Senator J.D. Mesnard. Over on the House side, we have Representative Shauna Bullock, Representative Andres Cano, Representative Frank Carroll, Representative Regina Cobb, Representative Timothy Dunn, Representative Mitzi Epstein, Representative Mark Fincham, Representative Becky Nutt, Representative Joanne Osborne, Representative Kevin Payne, Representative Warren Peterson, Representative Pamela Powers Hanley, Representative Lorenzo Sierra, Representative Ben Toma. And we're also glad to have a handful of newly elected members with us today. Representative-elect Judy Burgess, Representative-elect Joseph Chaplick, Representative-elect Steve Kaiser, Representative-elect Jacqueline Parker, and Representative-elect Beverly Pingarelli. Thank you all for taking time to join us today. The Arizona Tax Research Association is extremely honored today to have the governor of our great state, Doug Ducey, join us. We appreciate him taking time out of his busy schedule to provide a recorded message for today's conference. As you all know, Governor Ducey is a proud Sun Devil, having graduated from ASU in 1986 with a bachelor's in finance, and chose to be an Arizonan forever along with his wife Angela and 3 sons after his graduation. His background as the CEO of Cold Stone Creamery is well known. He's also served for various organizations, including the Thunderbird Charities, the Catholic Community Foundation, and the Pat Tillman Foundation. He was first elected to public office in 2010 as a state treasurer, a position he held through 2014, whereupon he became elected to his first term as the governor of Arizona. In his first year, Governor Ducey was greeted with a massive budget deficit to handle and set the stage for future successes by successfully closing that budget deficit in that year. His tenure as governor is highlighted with many successes, including forging a compromise in a long-standing school funding lawsuit and the ultimate passage of Prop 123. Governor ATRA greatly appreciates your commitment to serving the taxpayers of Arizona, and we're grateful for the open communication that we always receive from your office and the taxpaying community. Without further ado, we'll bring up Governor Doug Ducey.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 ATRA Outlook Conference. First, I want to congratulate ATRA on celebrating 80 years of developing sound and responsible tax policy in our state. And a big thank you to Kevin McCarthy and his whole team for their hard work year after year to make our tax code simpler and Arizona more competitive. ATRA has been a consistent leader in building Arizona's national reputation, and the work is paying off. Of course, 2020 has brought challenges none of us could have ever predicted, and I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on that today. With COVID-19 cases rising again nationally and in Arizona, we remain focused on combating this virus and protecting public health. It's our focus 24/7 because we know how important keeping the virus at bay is to the health of our citizens and to the health of our economy. In Arizona, we've been able to keep our economy safely open and moving through this pandemic, and I intend to keep it that way. We know that this is so important to the health and well-being of all Arizonans. While some other states and cities shut down their entire economies last spring and are doing it again, in Arizona, we've done everything to resist those calls. Some of those calls were pretty loud, and they remain vocal. Let's continue to promote the fundamentals. Wear a mask, maintain physical distancing, wash your hands, stay home when you're sick, and avoid large events. There's a reason we aren't together for this conference this year. It's all about containing the spread and saving lives. And we know now that we can do those things while keeping blood pumping through our economy safely. And here's why it matters. While many other states are awash in red ink and calling for federal bailouts, Arizona finished the most recent fiscal year with a $370 million cash carry forward. Those are dollars to invest as needed in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and to return to the everyday taxpayers and small business owners who have been really impacted this year. A big thanks to our legislature, especially Speaker Bowers and President Fan, for helping us weather the storm so responsibly. There's been a lot of talk about unemployment. Well, we all know the best way to help those who are unemployed is with a job. And I'm proud to report that even after all we've been through, unemployment in Arizona is below the national average. In fact, we've recovered nearly 95% of jobs lost during the spring and summer months. And we rank in the top 5 in year-over-year employment change. We've got a great story to tell in the state of Arizona. In 2019, we achieved the most significant tax reform of the last 30 years, making our tax code simpler, flatter, and more fair. It was recognized by economists nationally as one of the best approaches to tax conformity in the country. Our thanks to the members and leadership of ATRA for helping to make it happen. And we're not done yet. The recent passage of Prop 208 was a setback, no doubt, but we can't let it take us off course. I expect its passage to result in the best economic minds in our state, including ATRA, to look for new ways to continue the path towards meaningful tax reform and pro-growth policies for our state. Let's work together next session to keep Arizona a land of less burdens on businesses, lower taxes on families, and more opportunity for all. In the work ahead, we'll continue to need partners like ATRA, fighting on behalf of taxpayers. And with out-of-state interests pumping millions into Arizona to experiment with bad policy, ATRA's work is more important than ever. I'm grateful for your advocacy over the last 80 years, and I'm confident that by coming together, we will emerge from 2020 stronger than ever. We have our work cut out for us, and Arizona stands ready to rise to the challenge. My thanks to Kevin, Jennifer, Sean, and the whole ATRA team. Keep up the great work and have a very happy and safe Thanksgiving.
Very good. Well, Governor, we appreciate those kind words. And I'm sure the ATRA Board of Directors appreciates the shout out for all the hard work that went into your leadership on tax conformity. That was a particularly good piece of legislation. Before we wrap up today's meeting, a couple of last quick items. Members of the Board of Directors